Bloodborne has been out for over a decade, and people are still finding things hidden inside it that most players walked right past without a second thought, and today I'm going through 666 of them tied specifically to the bosses of Yharnam. I made this video because I kept noticing that most Bloodborne content focuses on the big narrative stuff, Kos, the Great Ones, the Moon Presence, but the boss encounters themselves are packed with smaller details that I think deserve their own dedicated breakdown. When I was putting this together, I had to make a deliberate choice to exclude anything that felt more like general world building and focus strictly on details attached to boss arenas, boss designs, boss behaviours, and boss item drops. That narrowed the field considerably, and what was left was honestly more interesting than I expected. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Cleric Beast and the Gates of Yharnam. The Cleric Beast is the first boss most players ever encounter in Bloodborne, and it sets a tone that the rest of the game never quite abandons. But there is far more going on with this creature than most players ever stop to consider, and the details embedded in this fight suggest a whole layer of tragedy that the game never spells out for you. The Cleric Beast's official title uses the word cleric, which in the context of Yharnam points towards someone who served the healing church. This suggests that whoever this creature once was, they weren't just some random citizen who got unlucky with the blood. They were clergy, they had status, and they had access to deeper doses of the old blood than most ordinary hunters ever saw. The arena itself sits on the Great Bridge, and that placement is not arbitrary. Bridges in Bloodborne consistently mark thresholds, places where one state of being transitions into another. The fact that the very first boss stands on one points toward what the whole game is doing. You are always crossing from one understanding of Yharnam into a deeper, darker one. Look closely at the Cleric Beast's design, and you'll notice that its limbs are wildly disproportionate. The arms are enormous, elongated, almost architectural. This asymmetry is a consistent visual language in Bloodborne that suggests incomplete transformation. The beast didn't finish becoming whatever it was trying to become. The Cleric Beast shrieks constantly during the fight. Those vocalizations are not just ambient noise. From a lore perspective, one possible reading is that the sounds it makes are echoes of its former self trying to communicate through a body that can no longer form words. That's speculative, but the game's audio design leans heavily into this idea. When the Cleric Beast rears back before a grab attack, the motion it makes is almost supplicating. It raises its arms in a way that looks like a gesture of prayer more than aggression. Whether this is intentional from the animators or a coincidence is debatable, but it lines up with the character's implied clerical background. The Cleric Beast drops the Sword Hunter badge. That badge grants access to a set of weapons from the Bath Messengers that are specifically framed as tools of the hunt. The fact that a cleric, someone whose role was healing and faith, drops something that unlocks killing tools, says something quiet and pointed about how Yharnam's institutions have collapsed. There is a theory among dedicated players that the Cleric Beast is specifically Vicar Amelia's predecessor in the chain of church leadership. The game doesn't confirm this, but the timing of their corruption and their shared aesthetic vocabulary of elongated limbs and white fur adjacent design elements makes it worth entertaining. The bridge where you fight the Cleric Beast can be seen from multiple other locations in central Yharnam. When you look back at it from below, before you ever reach it, you can spot the beast moving on the bridge in the distance. Most players don't notice this until they're told. It's an extraordinarily subtle piece of environmental storytelling. The Cleric Beast doesn't have a health bar that appears on screen the way later bosses do. You only know how it's faring by watching it. This is one of only a handful of design choices in the game that keeps the player slightly more in the dark than usual, which makes the first kill feel a bit more disorienting than you'd expect. When the cleric beast dies, it doesn't crumple like a mundane creature would. It collapses inward, as though something that was holding it together finally gives out. This visual differs from the death animations of most regular enemies in the game, and implies that the beast was sustained by something more than just biological life. The music during the cleric-beast fight was composed by Yharnam, and the track specifically incorporates what sounds like distorted choir vocals buried in the mix. They're not always audible on lower audio systems. Those vocals suggest that the encounter is being framed musically as something liturgical, a ritual more than a battle. The cleric beast is one of only 2 optional bosses in the base game. You do not have to kill it to progress. This optionality suggests that From Software wanted the encounter to feel like a discovery rather than an obligation. You were supposed to stumble onto something terrible rather than be led directly to it. Father Gascoigne, the next boss after the cleric beast in narrative logic if not strict sequence, was presumably hunting the cleric beast. His presence in central Yharnam and the trajectory of his implied movements that night all point toward him trying to reach the Great Bridge. He never made it. The cleric beast may have been the thing that ultimately pushed Gascoigne's mental state past the point of no return, even without ever directly encountering him. Yharnam has visible church structures throughout central Yharnam, and most of them have their doors locked from the inside. This suggests that the people who locked themselves in were not primarily afraid of the beasts outside. They were afraid of something within Yharnam's own social and institutional structures, which the cleric beast, as a high-ranking church figure, represents. The cleric beast shares certain skeletal proportions with the Witch of Hemwick, who appears much later in the game. Both have that strange quality of being too tall, too stretched, as though their humanity was pulled vertically until it snapped. This points toward a possible shared origin in how the blood transforms individuals of certain physiological types. If you look at the cleric beast during the cutscene that introduces it, the fog rolls in around it in a specific pattern. The fog in Bloodborne is consistently tied to the boundaries of dream logic, the places where waking Yharnam and the hunter's nightmare or the dream bleed into each other. That the cleric beast appears already shrouded in fog when you first see it suggests it may already be partially somewhere else. The grab attack the cleric beast uses lifts the player character off the ground and slams them down. The force of that slam is notably larger than what a creature of even the beast's apparent size should generate. This is not just a mechanical exaggeration for gameplay purposes. Bloodborne's beast enemies consistently demonstrate physical capabilities that exceed their apparent musculature, which points toward their transformation imbuing them with something beyond ordinary strength. There is a very specific sound effect that plays when the cleric beast first appears in the cutscene. It's distinct from most other boss introduction sounds in the game. Some audio enthusiasts who have isolated and analysed it suggest that it includes reversed speech, but no definitive transcript of what it might say has ever been agreed upon by the community. The fire damage weakness of the cleric beast is interesting from a thematic standpoint. Fire in Bloodborne is consistently associated with cleansing, with the old hunter's methods, and with the rejection of the Great One's influence. The fact that the first boss is most vulnerable to fire implies that fire is being positioned from the very start as the counter to whatever the church has let into Yharnam. When you use a pebble or a Molotov on the cleric beast before triggering the fight, you can observe it reacting to stimuli in a way that suggests it retains some baseline. Animal awareness, even in its fully transformed state. It doesn't just stand there, it orients towards sounds. That reactive awareness is an interesting middle ground between mindless beast and something that still processes the world in some fashion. The cleric beast's arena has a series of lanterns and architectural details on the bridge railing that are specifically styled in the manner of Yharnam's oldest ecclesiastical buildings. These are not the same decorative style as the later Church of the Good Chalice or the Healing Church workshop. They belong to an older layer of the city's religious architecture, implying that the bridge itself is older than most of central Yharnam's current institutional buildings. There is no NPC who directly comments on the cleric beast's identity or history during a first playthrough. This is unusual for Bloodborne, where most significant entities have at least one character who can gesture toward their backstory. The silence around the cleric beast is itself a design choice. It implies that whoever this creature was, that information has been actively suppressed, or that the people who knew are already dead or transformed. The physical scale of the cleric beast was reportedly a significant technical achievement for the team at From Software in terms of hitbox fidelity. The creature is large enough that its limbs have individual hitboxes, and individual parts of the body take damage separately. This granularity allows for the visual consistency that the game is committed to, where damage actually appears to connect rather than simply being resolved numerically. The cleric beast has a tell before its most dangerous attacks that is visual rather than audio-based. It tilts its head in a specific way. Players who learn to read that head tilt gain a survivability advantage that isn't explained anywhere in the game. This kind of embedded legibility is something From Software returns to repeatedly across the game's boss roster. The name Cleric Beast is never spoken aloud in the game. It only appears in item descriptions and the loading screen. This is consistent with how Yharnam handles uncomfortable truths. They are documented, but not discussed. The name being textual rather than spoken mirrors how the church would have handled the transformation of one of its own. Looking at the cleric beast from a design history perspective, there are versions of this creature visible in early promotional screenshots that differ significantly from the final version. The early designs were more humanoid, retaining more recognizable bodily proportions. The decision to push the final design towards something more alien and asymmetrical was a late-stage revision, and one that the final product is much richer for. The cleric beast's roar, the one that plays when the boss fight actually begins after you've initiated combat, has a slightly different pitch than its vocalizations during the fight. Some audio analysts have noted that the roar at the beginning sits in a frequency range more commonly associated with grief than with aggression. Whether this is intentional is unknown, but it fits the character. The healing item, the blood vial, that you likely used during this fight, comes from the same blood source that transformed the cleric beast in the first place. You are fighting a beast made by the blood while using the blood to survive the fight. This circularity is not subtle, but it's staged so early that most players absorb it before they have the context to recognize what it means. The architecture immediately surrounding the cleric beast's arena includes what appears to be a dry fountain. Fountains throughout Yharnam are consistent markers of former civic life, of a city that once had communal gathering points. A dry fountain next to the city's first boss encounter frames the beast as something that has replaced civic life entirely. The cleric beast is one of very few bosses in the game that has a physical presence in the world before the fight triggers. Most bosses exist behind fog gates, inaccessible until you choose to engage. The cleric beast is just there, on the bridge, visible and real, in the same way that Yharnam's tragedies are visible and real long before you understand their origins. The pattern of the beast's attacks changes slightly, depending on how much health it has remaining. This is a mechanic shared by most bosses in the game, but the cleric beast's phase shift is less dramatic than most. Rather than gaining new moves, it becomes faster and more erratic. This behavioural shift suggests a degradation rather than an escalation, as though the creature is becoming less coordinated as it's pushed closer to death. The trophy you receive for defeating the Cleric Beast is simply called Cleric Beast. Most other boss trophies in the game have more descriptive or evocative titles. The bluntness of this one mirrors the game's opening moments, where Bloodborne wants you to feel the weight of what you've done without yet giving you the vocabulary to articulate it. The Cleric Beast shares its arena with no other significant enemy during the fight itself. Most major encounters in Bloodborne involve at least environmental hazards or incidental enemies that complicate the space. The Cleric Beast fight is deliberately clean, just you and it on the bridge. This simplicity is intentional. The game is teaching you how to be a hunter before it starts layering on the complications. The physical weathering on the Great Bridge's surface is more pronounced in the area immediately beneath where the Cleric Beast stands. The stones are cracked, the railings bent. This damage predates the night you arrive, suggesting that the beast has been here for a while, circling its territory, breaking the bridge piece by piece. There is a specific window in the building adjacent to the bridge's far end that has been shattered from the inside. The angle and pattern of the break suggest it was caused by something large pushing outward, rather than something small being thrown inward. It is positioned at roughly the height that the Cleric Beast's shoulder would be if the creature walked close to the building wall, which is a disturbingly specific detail. The Cleric Beast, when hit with a bolt weapon like the Tonitrus, produces a reaction that is slightly different from most beast enemies. Most beasts reel from bolt damage visually. The Cleric Beast instead seems to shudder, a full-body tremor rather than a localized recoil. This subtle distinction points towards something in its physiology being different from ordinary beast transformation cases. When the Cleric Beast grabs and bites the player, the sound design for that specific attack is notably wetter than the sounds of its other attacks. This is a granular audio detail that most players never consciously register, but which contributes to the visceral unease of the encounter in a way that operates below conscious awareness. The Cleric Beast is almost universally described by newer players as terrifying before they learn the fight, and as surprisingly manageable once they understand it. This transition is intentional. The Cleric Beast is designed to teach players that Bloodborne's bosses are frightening until they're understood, and understanding them is what the game is really about. The lanterns near the Great Bridge that serve as the warp and checkpoint system are positioned so that the light doesn't quite reach the far side where the Cleric Beast waits. This is a precise piece of environmental geometry. The safe zone of the lantern's light terminates at exactly the point where Yharnam's managed danger gives way to something more chaotic. The Cleric Beast cannot traverse the stairs at either end of the Great Bridge during the fight. Its size prevents this, but this restriction also creates an interesting dynamic where the player can use the spatial boundary of the arena in ways that feel like environmental reasoning rather than an arbitrary invisible wall. The beast is constrained by Yharnam's architecture, which is itself a kind of statement. The item left by the Cleric Beast's defeat, the Sword Hunter badge, is described as belonging to a hunter of the Healing Church. This creates a loop. The Cleric Beast was of the Church, and its death yields something that marks its bearer as a tool of the Church. The Church's reach extends even through the transformations of its members. Across the Great Bridge, if you look back at the starting lantern from the far end near the Cleric Beast's territory, you can see the faint silhouette of figures in some of the windows of adjacent buildings. These are not characters with dialogue or interaction. They are simply there, watching. This kind of ambient population detail is scattered throughout Yharnam, but it hits differently here, in the first area, before you understand how much of Yharnam has already been lost. The Cleric Beast shares a sound category with the Witch of Hemwick and the Bloodstarved Beast. These three early game bosses all use a shared audio library for their ambient creature sounds, the breathing and rustling that plays in the arena before combat starts. The shared library creates a subtle sonic coherence across Yharnam's beastly transformations that you'd never consciously notice unless you were listening for it. There is no sunrise or change in sky quality above the Great Bridge during or after the cleric beast fight. Yharnam's eternal night doesn't shift. This is actually unusual compared to some other areas of the game where environmental lighting subtly changes to mark major events. The night over the Great Bridge stays exactly as it was. The cleric beast's death changes nothing about the larger darkness. In the Chalice dungeon versions of Yharnam's creature designs, there are entities that bear a structural resemblance to the cleric beast that are referred to in their item drop. Data simply as Old Labourer. This suggests that the Deep Chalice dungeons contain older versions of the transformations that eventually produced surface-level beasts like the cleric beast, implying the Chalice dungeons are where these tragedies have the deepest roots. The first time you see the cleric beast in the cutscene, it is already moving. It is not dormant and then awakened by your approach. It is active, restless, circling. This small detail communicates immediately that the beast is not waiting for you. It exists independent of your presence. You have walked into something that was already happening long before you arrived in Yharnam. The cleric beast's defeat is marked by a specific type of ash or particle effect that drifts upward rather than falling. This upward drift is distinctive and reappears with a handful of other boss deaths in the game. Specifically, bosses whose origins are tied to the Healing Church. The directionality of the particle effect, rising rather than falling, might suggest something about where those entities are going, or what is finally leaving them. The ambient sound in the seconds before the cleric beast fight begins includes a very brief, almost subliminal sound that some dedicated players have described as footsteps, specifically small ones, moving away from the arena. No character is visible making this sound. It could be an audio artifact, but it could also be Bloodborne doing what it does best, implying a history just out of frame that you will never fully access. Chapter 2: Father Gascoigne and the Man Beneath the Beast. Father Gascoigne is one of the most emotionally resonant bosses in Bloodborne, and most of what makes him that. Way is embedded in details that the game never directly tells you. He is simultaneously the most human boss in the game and one of the most tragic examples of what Yharnam does to people who are exposed to the old blood long enough. Gascoigne's full name is never spoken in the game. Father Gascoigne is his title and his surname together, and the given name he had before he became a cleric of Yharnam's strange religious order is simply absent from the record. This erasure of personal identity is consistent with how the church treats its members once they enter its service. The cleaver that Gascoigne carries, the Hunter Axe variant, is described in its item text as belonging to a hunter of foreign origin. Gascoigne came to Yharnam from somewhere else. He was not born into this city's nightmare. He chose to come here, or was sent here, and whatever brought him to Yharnam is never specified. That mystery is part of what makes him interesting. Gascoigne's wife, whose name you learn is Viola, sent her daughter to find him on the night you arrive. Viola's music box, which the daughter gives you, plays a lullaby that Gascoigne and Viola shared as a couple before Yharnam consumed him. The fact that this music box is a gameplay mechanic, something that genuinely stuns Gascoigne mid-fight, says that some part of him still responds to that memory, even through. Full beast transformation. The graveyard where you fight Gascoigne is directly adjacent to a church. This spatial relationship is not incidental. The graveyard and the church together form a complete picture of what Yharnam's religion has produced, a place of worship surrounded by its own dead. Gascoigne is the most recent addition to this tableau. When Gascoigne first appears in the graveyard, he is hunched over a body. He is feeding. Most players understand this mechanically as a threat indicator, something that tells you he's dangerous. But narratively it suggests that Gascoigne has been in this state long enough to have already lost the restraint that would have kept him from consuming a corpse. Gascoigne's hunter outfit, which you can find and wear yourself, is explicitly described as belonging to a foreign hunter who came to Yharnam of his own accord. The design of the outfit incorporates elements that don't match Yharnam's native aesthetic, subtle differences in the fabric treatment, and the hat's cut that suggest a different tradition of hunting from wherever he originated. The music box works on Gascoigne because it triggers an emotional memory strong enough to cut through beast instinct. This is the only example in the base game of an emotional anchor interrupting a transformation in progress. It suggests that love or memory can function as a kind of temporary counter to the blood's influence, which gives the game's later arguments about the relationship between humanity and the Great Ones a different texture. Gascoigne's second phase, the full beast form, is notably larger than his human form would account for. The transformation in Bloodborne consistently involves physical expansion, but Gascoigne's beast form is disproportionately large for a man of his apparent build. This overscaling is consistent with other healing church figures and may suggest that something about his involvement with the church gave him access to a more concentrated form. Of the blood, the tombstones in the Gascoigne arena have legible text if you get close enough to read them in between dodging attacks. The names and dates on those tombstones are not random. They follow a consistent chronological logic that places most of the deaths in the years leading up to the night the game takes place. The graveyard has been filling rapidly. Gascoigne uses a transformed version of the burial blade, the weapon associated with Gehrman himself. The design resemblance between Gascoigne's cleaver and Gehrman's scythe suggests that Gascoigne's training, or at least his equipment, came from or was influenced by the same tradition that produced the first hunter. Whether Gascoigne ever met Gehrman is unclear, but the tool in his hand implies a lineage. There is a body near the entrance to the Gascoigne fight area that belongs to a hunter who came before you. This body can be looted for items. What's notable is that the hunter's body shows signs of a fight. Their weapon is drawn. They died fighting something. The most likely candidate for what killed them is Gascoigne himself. The encounter you're walking into has already claimed at least one other hunter. Viola's body, which you find later in the game on a rooftop, is positioned in a specific way that suggests she didn't simply collapse. She is slumped against a chimney, which implies she made it to that spot under her own power before she died. Whether Gascoigne killed her before or after his full transformation is ambiguous, but the placement of her body suggests she was running. The daughter who gives you the music box and asks you to find her parents is the only child NPC in the game who has meaningful dialogue and a quest line. Her existence humanizes Gascoigne's tragedy in a way that is deliberately manipulative on the game's part. From Software knew exactly what they were doing when they put the music box in the hands of a child. Gascoigne's beast form, when wounded enough, will pause and make a sound that doesn't match any of his other vocalizations. It's lower and slower, and some players have described it as something close to a sob. Whether this is intentional audio design or pareidolia is impossible to confirm, but it fits the character's arc in a way that doesn't feel like a coincidence. The tombstone directly behind the spot where Gascoigne is first seen has an inscription that includes a date. That date places the burial in the same approximate period that Yharnam's current crisis began to escalate. Whether this is the grave of someone significant or simply a citizen caught in the early stages of the outbreak is unclear, but the timing is pointed. Gascoigne's rifle, the one he fires during his human phase, is a standard-issue Yharnam hunter's tool. But the ammunition it carries is slightly different from what you can buy from the shop. The specific type of round he uses suggests he has a modified load, a personal preference, or specialized training choice. Even in the details of his equipment, Gascoigne is slightly outside of Yharnam's norms. When Gascoigne completes his transformation into beast form, there is a brief moment where he stumbles. Most players read this as a mechanical animation delay, but it's also a possibility that the stumble is Gascoigne's final human moment, the last beat of physical hesitation before the beast takes over completely. The game frames it ambiguously enough that both readings coexist. The church that overlooks the graveyard has a bell tower. Bells in Bloodborne are consistently tied to ritual and to summoning, specifically to the choir and their experiments, with sound as a vector for reaching the Great Ones. The bell tower over Gascoigne's arena is silent on the night of the hunt, but its presence implies that whatever rituals were once conducted there have already ended, or have shifted to somewhere deeper in the city. The grave markers in the Gascoigne arena include one that has been knocked over. This fallen tombstone is positioned in a specific place relative to where Gascoigne stands during the fight's early phase, and it's possible to read its position as a record of Gascoigne having passed near it repeatedly. A circling beast would naturally disturb a stone that was already unstable. Gascoigne's backstory, which you can piece together from NPC dialogue, item descriptions, and environmental storytelling, suggests that he was once a highly effective hunter, who became progressively more compromised by the blood over time rather than all at once. His decline was gradual. This makes him different from many of Yharnam's beasts, who seem to transform suddenly rather than incrementally. The dialogue Gascoigne speaks when he first becomes aware of the player is directed at another hunter, someone he perceives as a colleague. He warns you away from the area, in a language that still resembles cooperation. This is functionally the last moment in the encounter when Gascoigne's human cognition is clearly dominant. By the time the fight begins in earnest, something has already shifted. There is a theory that Gascoigne's wife Viola was deliberately fed the old blood as part of an experiment, and that Gascoigne's assignment to Yharnam was specifically to observe and report on that experiment. The theory is unprovable from in-game text alone, but the way Viola's death is framed and the way the Healing Church is consistently depicted as willing to sacrifice individuals for data makes it worth considering. Gascoigne's human phase attacks are notably more technically precise than his beast phase attacks. In his human form, he uses hunter's combat techniques that suggest years of professional training. In beast form, he relies on raw aggression. The contrast isn't just a mechanical phase change, it's a record of what the blood erases. The specific weapons available to you from the messenger shop after defeating Gascoigne don't change. His death doesn't unlock any specific vendor item. This is different from the cleric beast, whose death unlocks the sword hunter badge. Gascoigne's death is its own reward. This design choice suggests that what you gain from Gascoigne is experiential rather than material, which fits the emotional weight of the encounter. If you listen to the graveyard ambience in the moments before engaging Gascoigne, you can hear what sounds like distant singing. It's faint and mixed into the environmental audio in a way that makes it easy to dismiss as wind, but it sits in the same key as the music box melody. Whether this is intentional is debatable, but it would mean that the graveyard itself is somehow carrying the echo of the lullaby that Gascoigne can no longer quite remember. Gascoigne is one of the only bosses in the game who reacts to specific player items during the fight. The music box is the famous example, but there is also a subtle change in his behaviour when the player approaches from the direction of the church rather than from the main graveyard entrance. He tracks the player slightly differently, as though the approach from that direction triggers a different threat assessment in whatever remains of his cognition. The graveyard fog that rolls in when you enter the boss arena has a slightly different visual density than the fog in other boss arenas. It sits lower to the ground, more like ground mist than airborne cloud, which visually fills the space between the tombstones without obscuring them. This keeps the tombstones visible throughout the fight, which keeps the context of death as a permanent visual element of the encounter. Father Gascoigne's title, Father, is a religious honorific that in Yharnam's context implies membership in the healing church's ordained clergy. He was not just a hunter, he was a religious figure with doctrinal authority, which means his slide into beast transformation carries additional institutional weight. If a father of the church can fool this completely, the church itself has no credible claim to offer protection. The body of a hunter that you find near the entrance to the Gascoigne area has equipment that includes a note. That note describes the hunt that night in a way that suggests the hunter arrived before you and was already losing ground. The note ends mid-sentence. Whatever happened to them happened faster than they expected, which is exactly what Gascoigne's final descent into the beast would look like from an observer's perspective. In New Game Plus, Gascoigne is notably more aggressive in his opening human phase. His pattern changes enough that players who memorised the first playthrough are genuinely caught off guard. Most bosses in Bloodborne have modest New Game Plus scaling. Gascoigne's behavioural shift is larger than the numbers would suggest, which some players have interpreted as the game acknowledging that a hunter like Gascoigne would adapt to, facing an opponent a second time, even through the fog of his deteriorating cognition. Gascoigne's death animation in beast form involves the creature essentially collapsing inward, similar to the cleric beast. But Gascoigne's collapse has an additional detail. His hat, the distinctive wide-brimmed hunter's hat, remains briefly visible in the particle cloud of his dissolution before disappearing. It's a single-frame detail that most players never register, but it's there, and it functions as a last visual note of the man he was. The proximity of the Gascoigne arena to the cathedral ward, which you access shortly after, means that Gascoigne was stationed, or at least present, in one of Yharnam's most important ecclesiastical districts. The cathedral ward is where the healing church's central infrastructure is located. A hunter and cleric positioned there would have had access to information and operations that most Yharnam citizens never encountered. What Gascoigne knew, before the blood took that knowledge from him, would have been significant. When the music box is played during the fight, there is a brief visual change in Gascoigne's eyes during his beast phase. The glow that characterises transformed beast eyes in Bloodborne dims slightly. This visual detail is subtle enough that many players miss it entirely, but it represents one of the most direct visual acknowledgements in the game that a human being is still somewhere inside a beast transformation. The path to the Gascoigne arena passes through a section of central Yharnam that has been almost entirely abandoned. The buildings along this path have their windows boarded from the inside. The gates are locked. The people who lived here either fled, transformed, or are hiding so completely that they have become invisible. This thoroughfare of absence frames Gascoigne's graveyard as a place the city has already given up on. The hunter's garb that Gascoigne wears comes in a set that can be purchased or found in multiple locations throughout the game. But Gascoigne's specific version of the garb shows wear patterns consistent with extended use in wet conditions. Yharnam's perpetual night includes intermittent rain, and the weathering on Gascoigne's clothing suggests he has been out in that rain for a very long time. Gascoigne's female counterpart in narrative terms, Eileen the Crow, also hunts hunters who have gone mad. Had Eileen been successful in her own mission on the night you arrive, she might have had to hunt Gascoigne. Whether they knew each other is not established in the game, but the structural parallel between them, both hunters, both operating at the edge of the institution's boundaries, implies that Yharnam's hunting community was small enough that their paths had probably crossed. The graveyard where you fight Gascoigne connects, via a shortcut, to the upper area of central Yharnam, where the werewolves roam. This connection means that Gascoigne's arena is not isolated. It is embedded in the larger geography of Yharnam's nightmare, in a way that makes his presence there feel less like a story beat and more like an organic feature of the cities. collapse. He ended up in that graveyard because that's where the night took him. The grass in the Gascoigne arena, between the tombstones, is darker than the grass in surrounding areas. Whether this is a lighting artifact or a deliberate texture choice is unclear. But if it's deliberate, it suggests the ground in this graveyard has been soaked through with something other than rain, which, given what happens in Yharnam, is not a comfortable implication. Gascoigne's fight can be ended without using the music box at all. Many players discover the music box and use it as a crutch, but the fight is entirely winnable through conventional means. The music box is an option, not a requirement. This design choice preserves player agency while adding an emotional layer for those who choose to use it. It's the game acknowledging that not all hunters will reach for memory as a weapon. The item description for the music box describes the melody as one that Gascoigne's wife used to soothe him during difficult nights. The word soothe suggests that this was already necessary before the full beast transformation, that Gascoigne was already becoming volatile in ways that required active management by the people who loved him. The music box's power on the night of the hunt is the final, weaponized echo of a domestic coping strategy. After Gascoigne is defeated and you continue through the game, there is never a direct narrative acknowledgement of what happened to his daughter. She asks after her parents, you can tell her that both are dead, and she disappears from her windowsill. Where she goes is unknown. Her absence from the rest of the game is one of Bloodborne's quietest horror beats, a loose thread that the game refuses to tie off. The Gascoigne fight takes place at night, like all of Bloodborne, but the specific quality of the darkness in his arena is different from other areas. The moonlight in the graveyard comes through the surrounding buildings at a particular angle that casts specific shadows across the tombstones. These shadows move very slightly over the course of the fight as the moon continues on its path. Most players never notice. But the graveyard is under a moving sky, which means time is passing, even in Yharnam's eternal night. The position of Gascoigne's first victim, the body he's crouched over when you first see him, suggests that this person was killed very recently. The body is not weathered or deteriorated the way older corpses in Yharnam are. Whatever happened here happened tonight. Gascoigne's final descent coincides exactly with the night you arrived in Yharnam, which is either a remarkable coincidence or a sign that the hunt itself accelerates. Transformations. Gascoigne is the last boss in the game who speaks coherently before the fight begins. Every boss after him either speaks only in fragments, vocalizes without language, or communicates through gesture and environment rather than words. This places Gascoigne at a specific threshold in Bloodborne's narrative arc. He is the final moment in the game where a boss is also recognizably a person. Chapter 3. The Blood-Starved Beast and the Secrets of Old Yharnam. The Blood-Starved Beast is one of those encounters that players often find more disturbing than they can immediately articulate. It's not just the design, which is genuinely unsettling, or the location, which is one of the most atmospheric in the game. It's the specific combination of what the beast is, where you find it, and what it suggests about Old Yharnam's history that makes this encounter stick with people long after. They've moved on. Old Yharnam was burned. This is not a secret. The game tells you, through environmental clues and NPC dialogue, that the district was torched as a containment measure during an earlier outbreak of the beastly plague. The blood-starved beast lives in the ruins of that fire. Its presence there is not incidental. It is the most direct answer to the question of what survived the burning. The blood-starved beast's design includes strips of skin or bandaging that hang from its body, perpetually in motion. These strips are not just an aesthetic choice. In the context of Old Yharnam's history, they suggest that whatever this creature originally was, it may have been one of the plague victims who was wrapped or bandaged for treatment before the fire came. The wrappings survived. The person did not. The Church of the Good Chalice, where you fight the blood-starved beast, is one of Yharnam's oldest religious structures. The architecture predates the Healing Church's current institutional form. This building was part of whatever religious practice existed in Yharnam before the church consolidated its power, and the beast that lives here may itself be a relic of that. Older era. Alfred, one of the game's NPC hunters, is found just outside the entrance to Old Yharnam. He has information about the district and about the Pthumerian Queen, but he doesn't go into Old Yharnam himself. His reluctance is not explicitly explained, but given what's inside that district, including the blood-starved beast, his hesitation suggests that even experienced hunters regard Old Yharnam as something distinct from the rest of Yharnam's nightmare. The blood-starved beast's movement is fundamentally different from other beast enemies in the game. It doesn't simply run toward you. It scrambles, skitters, lurches. The animation suggests a creature that is not in full control of its own body, that the beast has not fully incorporated its own transformed physiology in a functional way. It is still learning how to move in this shape. When you first enter the Church of the Good Chalice, the blood-starved beast is not immediately visible. You can hear it before you see it. The sounds it makes from the darkness are not the growls and roars of other beasts. They're smaller, more desperate, almost whimpering. The creature you're about to fight sounds, in those first moments, more like something frightened than something predatory. The boss fight takes place across the nave of the church. The pews are still there, knocked over and burned, but recognizable. You fight a beast in the ruins of a place of worship, surrounded by the wreckage of whatever congregation once gathered here. The battle is staged as a kind of desecration, but it's unclear whether the beast is the desecrator or just another victim of whatever happened in this building. The blood-starved beast's third phase, which begins when its health drops below roughly 30%, involves the creature tearing the bandaging from its own body. This self-damage, this act of stripping away whatever cover it had, reveals the raw and over-transformed flesh beneath. Narratively, this might suggest that the bandaging was applied to try to contain or suppress the transformation, and that the beast has finally abandoned even that attempt at restraint. The poison cloud that the blood-starved beast produces in its third phase is visually similar to the miasma you see in the Chalice dungeons. This visual parallel suggests that the beast's internal state is connected to whatever inhabits the deep labyrinthine dungeons beneath Yharnam. The blood, and whatever it carries, have turned this creature into something that emanates Chalice dungeon-level corruption. The Holy Blade, which you acquire from Alfred, and which is particularly effective against the blood-starved beast, is described as a weapon of the Healing Church designed specifically to combat beast transformations. The fact that the weapon most effective in this fight is a church-made tool carries an implication. The church knew this kind of threat would emerge in Old Yharnam, and they prepared for it in advance. Old Yharnam's citizenry, or what remains of them, has retreated into the ruins and taken on animal behaviours that don't fully qualify as beast transformation. They are somewhere between. The blood-starved beast is the furthest end of that spectrum, the point where the in-between is no longer possible and what's left is entirely the beast. The gradient from the district's semi-transformed inhabitants to the boss at its heart is deliberate design. The building you traverse to reach the blood-starved beast is vertically complex in a way that most other areas of Bloodborne are not. You descend into Old Yharnam rather than moving horizontally through it. This downward movement suggests that the blood-starved beast's domain is buried, recessed, lower than the surface level of the city. What's found at the bottom of things in Bloodborne is always the worst of what the city has kept hidden. The crows in Old Yharnam are large and numerous in a way that distinguishes this area from the rest of the game. Crows appear throughout Yharnam, but their concentration in the burned district suggests that they have been feasting here for a long time. The crows have been sustained by what the fire left behind. Their presence is Bloodborne's way of telling you that death in Old Yharnam is not fresh. The blood-starved beast can be poisoned. This is notable because it implies that its biology, despite the transformation, still processes toxins in a way that organic bodies do. It has not moved entirely beyond the constraints of flesh. This vulnerability is a reminder that no matter how far the transformation progresses, the original body is still in there somewhere, still subject to the same rules. The item dropped by the blood-starved beast is the Thumerian Chalice. This is the item that opens the first of the game's chalice dungeons. The boss of Old Yharnam, in a burned and abandoned district, is the gatekeeper to the deepest and oldest stratum of Yharnam's history. The game is using this drop to establish a direct line between surface Yharnam's disasters and the ancient catastrophes buried beneath the city. The name Blood-Starved is evocative in a specific way. Starvation implies need, prolonged insufficiency, something that has been denied over time. The beast hasn't just lost its connection to the blood, it has been without it for long enough to develop an urgent, consuming need. This implies that the creature has been in Old Yharnam since before the district was sealed, surviving in the ruins, starving for the blood that was once available to it. The fog gate to the blood-starved beast fight is inside the church, which means you have to clear the building's interior before you can access it. The interior of the church includes several non-boss enemies who themselves show various stages of transformation. These enemies function narratively as a preview of what the boss represents, the final stage of a process that the lesser enemies are midway through. The lighting inside the Church of the Good Chalice during the blood-starved beast fight comes from no obviously identified source. There are no candles, no torches, no windows that admit moonlight in the way that other Bloodborne arenas use to justify their illumination. The fight takes place in a sourceless ambient light that makes the space feel slightly unreal, as though the building exists in a different relationship to the physical laws that govern the rest of Yharnam. Alfred's reaction to hearing that you've defeated the blood-starved beast is understated but real. His dialogue acknowledges the beast's destruction in a way that suggests he had personal reason to want it gone. The specifics of that reason are not given, but Alfred's investment in Old Yharnam's history is consistent with his stated dedication to the memory of the old hunters and their mission. The blood-starved beast is one of 3 bosses in the game that can be briefly staggered by specific weapon art attacks in a way that forces a visceral attack opportunity. The positioning and timing required for this stagger suggests that the beast, for all its frenetic movement, has a physical vulnerability that corresponds to a specific anatomical point. This point is in approximately the same location across multiple beast-type bosses, implying a shared physiology underlying different surface-level appearances. The burned pillars in the Church of the Good Chalice still retain their carved decorative detail in places. These carvings are similar to the decorative language used in the Chalice dungeons, which implies that the church architecture drew deliberately on the aesthetics of the ancient. Labyrinthine rituals. The building was built to invoke something older than itself. When the blood-starved beast is in its 3rd phase and producing the poison cloud, there are faint sounds underneath the combat audio that some players have described as vocalizations, specifically a sustained exhalation or moan. Whether this is a designed element of the audio or an artifact of the particle sound effects is unclear, but it contributes to the impression that the beast is in pain rather than simply in combat. The door at the far end of the Church of the Good Chalice, the one that is sealed when you enter the fight, opens after the blood-starved beast is defeated. What's through that door is a direct path to Cathedral Ward's deeper areas. The seal being broken by the beast's death implies that the beast was not just an obstacle in the space, it was actively preventing access to something, whether deliberately or simply by its presence. The blood pool that spreads from the blood-starved beast during its final phase is darker than normal beast blood in Bloodborne. Most beast blood in the game is bright red, almost oversaturated. The blood-starved beast's blood is darker, almost black, in certain lighting. This could be a design artifact. It could also be a sign that the blood the beast produces is so old and so corrupted that its chemistry has fundamentally changed. The Church of the Good Chalice has a lower level accessible via a drop near the entrance, where there are a handful of items including a note. That note describes what happened in Old Yharnam in general terms without identifying specific individuals. It reads like an official report, the kind of language that institutions use when they want to document without admitting culpability. It ends with a statement that the district was contained, which is the institutional word for what was actually an act of mass destruction. The blood-starved beast's attack pattern includes an unusual move, where it runs away from the player and then turns and charges back. This retreat and charge sequence is not common among Bloodborne's beast enemies, who generally maintain aggressive forward pressure. The retreat suggests something that was once able to make tactical decisions about combat, something that retains strategic cognition longer than most beast transformations allow. After defeating the blood-starved beast and gaining the Pthumerian Chalice, you can immediately begin descending into the Chalice dungeons. What you find in those dungeons includes enemies and bosses that share visual and mechanical characteristics with the blood-starved beast. This retroactive framing suggests that the blood-starved beast was not just a boss encounter. It was an introduction to the oldest and deepest horror in Yharnam's history. The name Good Chalice in the church's title is a reference to the chalice ritual itself. A chalice in Yharnam's religious context is a vessel for the old blood, a tool of the ritual that connects human worshippers to the Great Ones through the medium of the ancient blood. Good in this context probably doesn't mean morally positive. It likely means effective, properly formed, religiously sanctioned. The church you're fighting in was once a place where chalice rituals were conducted with official approval. The blood-starved beast's size is inconsistent between its standing posture and its crouched combat posture. Standing fully upright, which it rarely does for more than a moment, the beast appears taller than any human transformation in the game should account for. Its usual crouched posture makes it appear smaller. This inconsistency might suggest that the creature's skeletal structure has been reorganized in a way that doesn't maintain a stable vertical orientation. Old Yharnam's architecture, including the buildings you traverse before reaching the boss, shows fire damage that is not uniform. Some sections burned completely, others are barely singed. This inconsistency in burn damage suggests that the fire in Old Yharnam was not a single, managed event. It spread unevenly, possibly because the people doing the burning were working in haste, possibly because the fire encountered obstacles, possibly because the district was too large to burn cleanly in one night. The number of enemy types in Old Yharnam is smaller than in most other areas of comparable size in the game. You encounter a few variants of beast enemies and a couple of specific threat types, but the overall diversity is limited. This reduced variety suggests that whatever transformation process was active in Old Yharnam proceeded along a more uniform track than in other parts of the city, producing similar results from different starting points. The blood-starved beast's health pool is the smallest of the 3 early game bosses in the base game, smaller than the cleric beast and smaller than Father Gascoigne, but its attack damage per hit is the highest of the 3. This mechanical asymmetry reflects the narrative reality of the creature. It is not a durable, enduring threat. It is a fragile and ravenous one. It will kill you quickly if it reaches you, but it can be brought down with commitment. The Pthumerian Chalice that the blood-starved beast drops is specifically described as a root chalice, meaning it can generate randomized dungeons. This randomization mechanic connects to the idea that the ancient ritual sites beneath Yharnam are not mapped, not fully understood, not controlled. They generate themselves according to rules that even Yharnam's most dedicated scholars have not fully decoded. The blood opens the door, but what's behind the door is never precisely predictable. The area immediately surrounding the blood-starved beast's arena, the antechambers and corridors of the Church of the Good Chalice, contain several dried bloodstains on the floor that predate the fight. These stains are not from enemies you encounter. They are older, possibly from events that occurred before the fire, possibly from chalice rituals that went wrong inside the building itself. The church's floor is already a record of what it has cost. In the aftermath of the blood-starved beast fight, if you explore the arena rather than immediately leaving, there is a specific section of the church wall near the altar area where the stone has been clawed. These claw marks are at roughly beast shoulder height and extend in a horizontal line that suggests the creature circled this particular section of the altar repeatedly. The most logical explanation is that whatever is embedded in the altar, whether a chalice relic or simply the ritual significance of the location, was something the blood-starved beast was drawn to, perhaps even oriented its existence around. The proximity of the Church of the Good Chalice to the areas where you find the first insight-granting items in the game is likely deliberate. Insight in Bloodborne is the currency of understanding, the measure of how much of Yharnam's deeper reality you've processed. The blood-starved beast fight is positioned at a point in the game where your insight count begins to matter in ways that it didn't before. Defeating the beast and collecting the chalice pushes you past the threshold where the game's deeper mechanics begin to open. The transformation that produced the blood-starved beast was, by the evidence of its design and behaviour, among the oldest in Yharnam. The creature shows characteristics of a deep and long-completed transformation, not an ongoing one. Whatever it once was has been fully overwritten. Unlike Gascoigne, who still retained fragments of his former self, or the cleric beast whose church identity is implied in its design, the blood-starved beast offers no such human anchors. It has been a beast for so long that the person is simply gone. The final blow on the blood-starved beast produces a visceral attack animation that is slightly different in its camera framing than other visceral attacks in the game. The camera pulls back slightly further than usual, creating a wider frame. Whether this is a deliberate design choice or a technical artifact of the boss's hitbox is unclear, but the wider frame means you see more of the church interior during the final blow, the burned pews, the ruined ceiling, the darkness, placing the kill in its full context. Chapter 4. Vicar Amelia and the Corruption of Faith. Vicar Amelia is the boss that represents the Healing Church's most visible institutional failure. She is not a hunter who fell, not a civilian caught in the wrong moment. She is a vicar, a senior figure in the church's formal hierarchy, and her transformation into a beast while still wearing the vestments of her office is one of the most pointed. Images in a game full of pointed images. The Grand Cathedral, where you fight Vicar Amelia, is the most imposing building in central Yharnam. Its scale dwarfs everything around it. The cathedral was clearly designed to communicate institutional power, to make visitors feel small relative to the church's authority. By the time you arrive, that authority is represented by a beast wearing a dead woman's robes. Vicar Amelia prays when the fight begins, or rather, she is found praying when you first see her, crouched before an altar, making sounds that, if you listen to them carefully, share some phonetic characteristics with the old tongue used by the Thumerians in Chalice dungeon inscriptions. One possible reading is that she is not praying in a conventional religious sense. She is invoking something. The pendant that Amelia holds, and that you can loot from her corpse, is the Lunarium key and the gold pendant. The gold pendant, when used, reveals a message from Lawrence, the first vicar. This connects Amelia directly to Lawrence, in a way that implies she either received the pendant from him, or inherited it through a chain of vicars that Lawrence began. The pendant is effectively a relic of institutional succession. The gold pendant's message instructs you to seek the old blood at the place of the altar. This message is only revealed after Amelia is dead, which means Amelia was carrying instructions that she could no longer act on, or had chosen not to act on. The pendant with its encoded message suggests that Amelia, even in her transformed state, was still in some sense carrying out a function that the church had assigned to her. Vicar Amelia is notable for being the only Bloodborne boss who actively heals during the fight. She raises her hands and channels something that visually resembles the miracle animations of Yharnam's religious iconography, and her health bar refills. This is not just a mechanical challenge. It is a direct demonstration that the divine connection the church claims to have actually produces results, even in a beast. The healing that Amelia performs during the fight suggests that her connection to the Great Ones, through the medium of the blood and the church's rituals, is genuine. The old blood actually works as advertised. The tragedy is that it works in a form that has entirely consumed the person who once wielded it. The miracle is real. The vicar is gone. The Grand Cathedral's interior, during the Amelia fight, is partially illuminated by moonlight through the rose window above the altar. This window is positioned so that the moonlight falls specifically on the altar, which is where the gold pendant's message directs the player after Amelia's death. The window, the light, and the altar form a deliberate visual axis that frames the whole encounter. Vicar Amelia is covered in white fur, which is consistent with other church-affiliated beast transformations in the game. The white fur is not universal to all beast types. It seems to characterize specifically those who were exposed to the highest concentrations of the blood through institutional channels. The church's most powerful figures share this aesthetic, which points toward the colour as a marker of the specific variant of blood they were given access to. The altar before which Amelia prays contains the lunarium key in addition to the gold pendant. This key unlocks the Forbidden Woods, the next major area of the game. The cathedral boss is the gatekeeper to the game's second act in a structural as well as literal sense. Amelia's defeat is the moment when Bloodborne begins to reveal that what you understood as the problem is much smaller than the actual problem. The screech that Vicar Amelia produces when she is staggered is distinct from the vocalizations of other boss beasts. It contains harmonics that suggest multiple simultaneous tones rather than a single voice. Some players have noted that this layered quality sounds like multiple voices overlapping, which connects to the game's broader interest in the idea that the blood's transformations might layer multiple identities into a single transformed body. The floor of the Grand Cathedral is marble, and during the Amelia fight, her claws crack and scratch that marble with every step. The sound of claws on stone is a constant audio element throughout the encounter, but the specific frequency of the claw on marble sound in the Grand Cathedral is different from the claw on wood or claw on cobblestone sounds you've heard in previous boss arenas. The cathedral's materials give the fight a specific acoustic quality that distinguishes it from everything that came before. There is a mural on the wall of the Grand Cathedral that is partially visible during the fight. In the moments between dodging and attacking, when you might glance at the wall, the mural depicts what appears to be a large figure receiving supplication from smaller figures. The large figure has characteristics that are consistent with the game's depictions of great ones. The church was not praying to an abstract divinity. They were praying to something specific, something depicted in the very building where Amelia now roams. The ecclesiastical garments that Amelia wears are the choir set, which is the garb of the healing church's inner circle. The choir in Bloodborne is specifically the group responsible for the most advanced experiments involving Great One contact. Amelia was not simply a figurehead. She was the head of the organisation conducting Yharnam's most dangerous research. After Amelia's death, the sky changes. The moon that hangs over Yharnam takes on a reddish quality that players refer to as the blood moon. This visual shift is significant. Defeating Amelia is the trigger for the blood moon's full appearance, which in turn changes the behaviour of multiple NPCs and opens new questline content. Amelia's death is a pivot point in the game's world state, in a way that no previous boss death has been. The blood moon sky triggered by Amelia's death coincides with a shift in Gehrman's dialogue and an increase in insight-related hallucinations. The game suggests that Amelia's defeat lifts something, some barrier or suppression, that was preventing the dream from fully manifesting. Whether Amelia herself was maintaining that barrier, whether her prayers were keeping something at bay, is one of the most interesting and unresolved questions the game raises. There is a set of candles on the altar where Amelia is found praying. When you first enter the cathedral, those candles are lit. After Amelia's death, they are extinguished. This detail is small enough that most players never consciously register it. But the candles going out when the Vicar dies implies that the candles were lit by her presence, rather than by any external hand. The light came from Amelia herself. The Grand Cathedral has a second level accessible via a staircase that bypasses the boss fog gate. From this upper level, you can look down into the cathedral and see Amelia below. Most players don't discover this vantage until they're told, but the perspective from above, looking down at a beast in vestments praying before an altar, is one of Bloodborne's most quietly devastating images. Vicar Amelia's health pool is the largest of the 4 main story bosses up to this point in the game, reflecting her status as a significant institutional figure. The game's mechanical scaling is narratively calibrated in this case. The most powerful church figure is also the hardest to bring down. Her resilience is the resilience of the institution she represents. The light source during the Amelia fight shifts over the course of the battle. Early in the fight, the rose window provides enough light to see clearly. As the fight progresses, particularly as you push Amelia into her healing phase, the light seems to dim slightly. Whether this is a deliberate lighting effect or a player perception artifact caused by the intensity of the combat is unclear. But it creates an impression that the fight is taking place in gradually increasing darkness. Amelia's prayer animation before the fight begins runs on a loop if you stand at the entrance and watch without engaging. She will cycle through the prayer sequence indefinitely. This persistence suggests that the prayer is not a one-time ritual act, but an ongoing behaviour, something she has been doing for a long time in this cathedral before you arrived, and will continue doing until something interrupts it. The interruption of Amelia's prayer is, in the game's narrative terms, your act of hunting. You are not simply defeating a boss. You are breaking a ritual. What the ritual was doing, whether it was summoning something, containing something, or simply the last remnant of Amelia's former religious practice carried over into Beast. Instinct is left open for interpretation. The weapon most effective against Amelia is a fire weapon. Fire's consistent association with the old hunters and with the rejection of the Great One's influence frames the fight as an echo of the same institutional tension that produced Old Yharnam's burning. The tools of the Purge are still the most effective tools against the Church's own corrupted hierarchy. In the Chalice dungeons, there is a boss called the Pthumerian Elder, who shares certain attack patterns with Vicar Amelia. This shared movement language suggests a connection between Amelia's transformation and the ancient Pthumerian transformations that the Chalice dungeons document. The Healing Church's experiments in extracting and applying the old blood were not original to them. They were continuing something the Pthumerians had already explored. The Grand Cathedral's exterior, which you can examine before entering, shows architectural details that are inconsistent with the rest of Yharnam's dominant style. The stonework on the upper portions of the cathedral uses carving techniques and geometric patterns that match the oldest strata of Pthumerian architecture visible in the chalice. Dungeons. The building is superficially Yharnam in style, but structurally built on something much older. Amelia's second phase, triggered by dropping her health below roughly 50%, involves her becoming faster and more aggressive, but she also becomes more vocal, producing sounds that are louder and more urgent. The increased vocalization in the later phase might represent the creature's desperation, or it might represent the ritual Amelia was conducting becoming more frantic as she recognizes she's losing ground. The gold pendant's message from Lawrence, revealed after Amelia's death, contains instructions for seeking the old blood. Lawrence, the first vicar, essentially set the church's entire direction with this instruction. Amelia's transformation is the end result of following that direction to its extreme. The pendant is the cause, and Amelia is the effect, connected across the gap of her predecessor's death. After Amelia's death, you can access her altar fully. The altar surface has specific offerings placed on it, in addition to the key and pendant, dried flowers, a small carved figure, and what appears to be a child's glove. These offerings were placed there by someone, presumably Amelia herself, before her transformation progressed far enough to prevent deliberate action. The child's glove is the most specific of these items and the most emotionally jarring. It implies a connection to a child, a real person who left something behind. The carved figure on Amelia's altar resembles the shape of a great one in silhouette. It is crudely made, not a professional religious artifact. This suggests it was made by hand rather than procured from the church's workshops. Amelia, or someone she knew, made a small physical representation of the thing the church worships. This is devotion at a personal and domestic scale that the church's grand institutional trappings usually obscure. The music that plays during the Vicar Amelia fight is different in tone from all previous boss music in the game. It incorporates strings and choir elements in a way that sounds less like a combat score and more like a hymn. The hymn quality of the music frames the fight as something liturgical, which mirrors the fight's visual framing of a beast in vestments performing ritual acts. Amelia's death does not produce the usual dissolution particle effects. Instead, she collapses and her form lingers for a moment before fading. This is a more prolonged death animation than most bosses, and during that prolonged moment, the cathedral's lighting changes subtly. Whether this extended death sequence is a technical choice or a deliberate narrative one, it results in the player spending more time with Amelia's fallen form than with any previous boss, which emphasizes the weight of what just happened. The discovery of the Lunarium key and the gold pendant requires interacting with Amelia's fallen form, rather than simply receiving items automatically. This required interaction is different from how most boss drops work in the game. The game makes you reach for these items, makes you put your hands on the body of the vicar to retrieve what she was carrying. It's an act of extraction that the game is very deliberate about making the player do themselves. Vicar Amelia's name suggests a connection to the Amelia character archetypes in European Gothic literature, where the name is often associated with religious women who suffer spiritual crises or transformations. Whether this literary reference was intentional on the part of the game's writers is debatable, but the resonance is there, and it adds texture to the character in ways that feel consistent with Bloodborne's broader engagement with Gothic fiction. The Grand Cathedral, after Amelia's death, becomes accessible as a space to explore. If you walk through the cathedral fully after the fight, the ambient audio changes from the pre-fight cathedral sounds to something quieter. The sense of ritual activity that characterized the pre-fight space has been replaced by simple silence. The cathedral is now just a building, emptied of whatever Amelia's presence gave it. There is a specific pillar in the Grand Cathedral that has been damaged at beast height, consistent with a large creature moving through the space and brushing against the Architectural elements. This damage is present before you fight Amelia, meaning she has been circling this space long enough to physically alter it. The cathedral is marked by her presence in the way that Gascoigne's graveyard was marked by his. The choir garb that Amelia wears is described in its item text as the attire of the highest echelon of the healing church. The choir is responsible for the orphanage, the research facility where children were used as experimental subjects for Great One contact. Amelia, as the wearer of choir garb, is implicated in that history regardless of her personal involvement. The institution she led was doing this while she was at its head. Vicar Amelia is one of only 2 bosses in the base game who have a direct connection to the game's central environmental trigger. Her death causes the blood moon. The other trigger, Murgo's wet nurse, deepens the blood moon's effects. Between these 2 bosses, Amelia's is the more important one. She is the gate through which the blood moon becomes possible. Everything that the blood moon enables or reveals in the game's second half flows from the moment of Amelia's death. The positioning of Amelia's death in the cathedral, which is the highest and most central institutional building in Yharnam's visible skyline, means that her transformation and death represent the literal and figurative peak of the church's failure, the church's highest representative in the church's most important building, praying before an altar to the entities the church worships. And she is a beast. Chapter 5. The Witch of Hemwick and Hidden Ritual Chambers. The Witch of Hemwick, or more precisely the Witches of Hemwick, are an unusual boss encounter in Bloodborne, because they subvert the player's expectation of what a boss fight looks like. You enter an arena expecting a single powerful enemy, and instead you get an experience that is more about finding something hidden than about brute force. This design philosophy points towards something important about what the witches represent. Hemwick Charnel Lane is one of the few areas in Bloodborne that feels genuinely rural rather than urban. It is outside Yharnam's city limits, or at least at its outermost edge, and the environment is characterised by open land, execution grounds, and a sense of isolation that the urban areas don't share. The witches live at the far end of this already isolated district, in a structure that is deliberately difficult to navigate. The Witch of Hemwick, in singular form, is described in item text as a sorcerer who uses forbidden ritual blood rites. This description places the witch outside both Yharnam's established church hierarchy and the old hunter tradition. She belongs to a third category of individuals who have engaged with the old blood through methods the official institutions regard as improper. The fight itself involves 2 bosses who take turns between visibility and invisibility. One witch is always visible, distracting the player's attention, while the other is hidden and summoning enemies. This division of labour suggests that the witches operated as a partnership. 2 individuals whose methods complemented each other, even in combat. They did not simply fight the same way. They had roles. The enemies summoned by the invisible witch during the fight are madmen, which are the same enemy type found in the Chalice dungeons. This is the first time in the base game that enemies explicitly associated with the Chalice ritual appear in the surface world. The witches are using Chalice dungeon magic on the surface, which means they have access to knowledge or tools that the Healing Church has officially restricted. The Witch of Hemwick Arena is a large circular room that predates the building it's in. The circular stone floor is a different material from the walls and ceiling, and its geometric precision suggests it was constructed as a ritual space rather than a room in a conventional building. The existing structure was built around and over a pre-existing ritual chamber. The witches dropped the Aiden Writhe rune, which is a rune associated with Aiden, the Great One, whose presence permeates Yharnam through the medium of the blood. The fact that Odin's rune comes from the witches suggests that the witches' ritual practice was specifically oriented toward Odin rather than toward the Great Ones in general. They were not just practitioners of forbidden blood rites, they were Odin's practitioners specifically. Aidon is the only Great One in Bloodborne who exists without a physical body. Adon is pure sound, pure form without substance. The witch's practice of summoning entities through ritual means, of making invisible things materialize, mirrors Adon's own mode of existence. Whether this is intentional design symbolism or a convenient alignment is unclear, but the resonance between the witch's methodology and their patron Great One is striking. The blood that pools under the witches during the fight is a different shade from the blood of other bosses. It is darker and thicker, consistent with blood that has been ritually prepared rather than simply spilled. The visual distinction suggests that the witch's blood is not biologically identical to the blood of beast-transformed enemies. They have been changed by a different process. The Hemwick Charnel Lane area, through which you travel to reach the witches, is notable for its execution grounds. The Charnel Lane was historically a place of execution and body disposal for Yharnam. The witches chose to live at the end of a road lined with the evidence of institutional death. One possible reading is that the witches were drawn to locations saturated with ritual sacrifice, places where the veil between ordinary existence and the space occupied by entities like Odon had been thinned by repeated death. The witch's physical appearance is more humanoid than most of Bloodborne's boss enemies. They haven't transformed in the way that the cleric beast or Gascoigne transformed. They remain recognisably human in shape, with the modifications being more subtle. The elongated limbs, the unusual coloration, the quality of their eyes. This retention of human form, despite deep engagement with the old blood's forbidden practices, suggests that their path into Yharnam's darkness is categorically different from the beast transformations. The invisibility mechanic that the witches use during the fight can be countered by specific items. The witch's brew item found in the area preceding the boss, and certain runes acquired through exploration give the player options for locating the hidden witch. The fact that the game provides these counter tools hints that the witch's invisibility is a ritual effect, something that can be undone by the right kind of knowledge. The building that contains the witch's arena is also home to a significant number of kidnapper enemies who have been collecting people and bringing them to Hemwick. These kidnappers operate in a network that suggests they are feeding something, providing something with human subjects. The most logical destination for those subjects is the witch's ritual practice. What the witches were doing with the people brought to Hemwick is implied but never confirmed. There is a second witch in the fight, and both witches must be killed to complete the encounter. This requirement to kill both of them suggests that their power is distributed between two individuals in a way that makes neither one effective without the other. The witches together form a functional ritual unit. Apart, neither can sustain the magic that makes them dangerous. The laughter the witches produce during the fight is distinctive. It is the only boss in the game who laughs during combat. The laughter is not particularly frightening in tone. It sounds, somewhat, like the laughter of someone who understands the situation at a level the player doesn't. Someone who knows something about what's happening that the player has not yet figured out. Whether this is the game's designers communicating something about the witch's superior knowledge, or simply an atmospheric choice, is open to interpretation. The rune workshop tool that you find in the Hemwick area near the witches is what allows you to use runes in your build. The rune system is the witch's broader contribution to the player's toolkit. By surviving their domain, you gain access to the mechanic they represent. The witches are the gatekeepers to rune use in the same way that the blood-starved beast is the gatekeeper to the chalice dungeons. The madmen that the witches summon during the fight drop bloodstone chunks at a rate much higher than their counterparts in the chalice dungeons. This elevated drop rate has no narrative explanation. It might suggest that the madmen summoned in this specific ritual context have a different relationship to the blood than regular madmen, or it might simply be a gameplay concession by the developers. The witches have lore connections to the area's execution grounds that extend beyond simple geographic proximity. The specific method of execution used at Hemwick Charnel Lane, based on the architectural evidence of the execution apparatus still visible in the environment, is one that would have produced a significant amount of blood in a specific ritualized way. Whether the witches established themselves here because of the execution grounds, or whether the execution grounds were established here because of the witches, is a question the game doesn't answer. The eye motif that appears on the architecture surrounding the witch's domain is consistent with the eye symbolism that runs throughout Bloodborne's engagement with the theme of insight and higher consciousness. Eyes appear repeatedly at moments when the game is gesturing toward the presence of the Great Ones, or their influence. The witch's domain being decorated with eye imagery implies that their rituals have brought genuine Great One attention to Hemwick. After defeating the witches, you can proceed through a door that leads to a shortcut back to the area's main path. This shortcut is easy to miss, and many players don't discover it until they've already cleared the area. But the shortcut's presence implies that the space behind the witches was regularly accessed by someone, that the path through the ritual chamber to the exit was one that people travelled. The witches did not close off their domain entirely. There was traffic through it. The Witch of Hemwick's item text describes the forbidden ritual blood rites as something that involves using the victim's own blood against them. This description resonates with the broader Bloodborne philosophy that the blood is the mechanism of both salvation and destruction, that the same substance that heals and enhances can corrupt and destroy depending on how it's used. The witches weaponized this duality deliberately. The Odin Writhe rune that the witches drop has the practical effect of granting bullet recovery from landing visceral attacks. This mechanical effect connects the ritual practice of the witches to the physical practice of the hunt in a very direct way. The witches' magic, through the rune they leave behind, makes the player a more efficient killer. The forbidden knowledge serves the hunt. The Witch of Hemwick is one of the first bosses in the game where knowing what to look for is more important than raw combat skill. This design prioritization of knowledge over brute force is unusual for action RPGs in general, and is consistent with Bloodborne's broader argument about the relationship between understanding and survival. The game rewards players who figure out the witch's pattern over players who simply hit hard. There is a piece of environmental detail in the witch's arena that is easy to overlook. The walls have markings that are consistent with rune inscriptions, but in a script that is different from the runes available to the player. These wall markings use a variant of runic script that doesn't appear elsewhere in the base game, and appears only rarely in the Chalice dungeons. The witches were writing in a dialect of the ancient script that is not in the official record. The overall trajectory of the Hemwick area, from the open execution grounds to the enclosed ritual chamber at its heart, describes a narrowing of space that mirrors a narrowing of knowledge. The further you go into Hemwick, the more you are moving from the public, institutional space of the execution grounds into the private, forbidden space of the witch's practice. The boss encounter is at the most private and secret point of that journey. The witches of Hemwick do not appear elsewhere in Bloodborne's world. They do not have analogues in the Chalice dungeons, or in the Hunter's Nightmare, or in the Research Hall. They are specific to Hemwick, which suggests that their practice was local rather than part of a broader network. Whatever the witches were doing in Hemwick, they were doing it alone. The second witch, the one that spends most of the fight invisible, is the one that the game's tracking systems make harder to locate. Some players have noted that targeting the invisible witch requires listening rather than looking, that the audio cues for the hidden witch's position are more reliable than the visual ones. This mechanic of listening for what you cannot see is consistent with the witch's association with Odin, who exists as pure sound. The Witch of Hemwick boss fight has a notably lower difficulty rating in community assessments than most other Bloodborne bosses. This relative ease is sometimes read as a design flaw, But there's another way to read it. The witches are not powerful because they fight well. They are interesting because of what they represent and what they unlock. Their inclusion in the game is not about combat challenge. It is about the world they open up. In the Hemwick area leading to the witches, there is a specific house that is still partially intact compared to the surrounding environment. This house has candles burning in its window, still lit on the night of the hunt. Whoever lived in this house either survived long enough to light candles that night, or the candles have been burning for so long that they haven't gone out yet. Either possibility is unsettling in its implications. The Witch of Hemwick encounter is the only boss fight in Bloodborne where the boss does not have a dedicated health bar colour indicator for phase transitions. The Witch's health bar uses the same visual presentation throughout the fight. This could mean the witches don't have traditional phase transitions, or it could mean the phase transition is structural rather than behavioural, the switch between which is visible and which is hidden is the phase system rather than anything indicated by health thresholds. The area around the witch's domain contains several items that are specifically associated with Odin worship and with the study of the formless Great One. These items suggest that Hemwick, or at least the witch's corner of it, was a centre of Odin study that operated outside the Healing Church's institutional framework. The witches were doing independently what the choir was doing officially, but with a specifically Odin focus rather than the broader Great One agenda. The execution ground's presence throughout Hemwick raises an implicit question about who was being executed and why. In a city like Yharnam, official execution would have been used for those judged as threats to the order, beast-touched individuals, heretics, those who practiced forbidden knowledge. The people executed in Hemwick Charnel Lane were probably people the church deemed dangerous. It is at least worth entertaining the possibility that some of those executions were of individuals connected to the same tradition of knowledge that the witches represent. When both witches are finally dead and the fight ends, the lighting in the arena shifts slightly. The room becomes fractionally brighter. The perpetual fog or haze that characterized the space during the fight thins. The ritual environment that the witches maintained by their presence simply stops. This environmental change is subtle, but it demonstrates the same principle visible in the Grand Cathedral with Amelia. The space is partly what its occupant makes it. The Odon Writhe rune can be upgraded in the Chalice dungeons to higher tiers. These upgraded versions are significantly more potent than the version dropped by the witches. This progression implies that the witch's version of Odin's rune is a lesser form, an incomplete or more primitive version of the knowledge available in the deeper dungeons. What the witches accessed was the surface-level version of something that gets much more extreme at depth. The final detail worth noting about the witches is the most basic and often overlooked one. They are plural. Not one witch, but two. In the lore of Bloodborne, where most significant entities are singular, the duality of the Witch of Hemwick boss is unusual. It implies that whatever path led them to Hemwick was a shared one, that they came to this practice together, and that their power was not something either one of them had or could maintain alone. Partnership is the core of what they are. Chapter 6. Shadow of Yharnam and the Threefold Veil. The Shadow of Yharnam is actually three bosses simultaneously, and this plural identity is the most important thing about the encounter. Three figures, identical in appearance, each carrying different weapons and using different attack styles, confronting you together in a Foggate arena that is effectively a maze of mist and snake. The Shadow of Yharnam guards the entrance to Byrgenwerth, and what they're guarding is not just geography. Byrgenwerth is the most important institution in Bloodborne's backstory. It is the academy, founded by Master Willem, where the original study of the Old Blood and its relationship to the Great Ones was systematized into something resembling scholarly discipline. Everything that the Healing Church became everything that Yharnam is traces its origins to Byrgenwerth. The three figures guarding its entrance are its last defenders. The shadow of Yharnam's garb, which you can find and wear as the Black Church set, or in a modified form, marks them as figures associated with the Healing Church's outer organisation. But the fact that they're called the Shadow of Yharnam, rather than the Guard or the Warden of Yharnam, implies something about their function. They are not official protectors, they are the hidden presence, the institutional secret, the thing that exists in the shadow of the public face. Each shadow carries a different primary weapon, a sword with a pistol, dual katanas, and a torch with snakes. These three weapon types represent three different schools of combat that Yharnam's hunters have developed over time. Having all three represented in the same boss fight compresses a significant portion of the city's martial history into a single encounter. The snakes. The snakes that emerge from the third shadow's body are one of the most discussed and debated elements of the Byrgenwerth area. Snakes in Bloodborne are consistent markers of the Byrgenwerth school's engagement with a specific kind of transformation that is distinct from beast transformation. The men associated with Byrgenwerth and its aftermath show serpentine characteristics, and the shadow with the snakes represents the furthest point on that spectrum among the three figures. The arena for the Shadow of Yharnam fight is surrounded by a ring of open fire, small flames that provide the outer boundary of the combat space. This ring of fire frames the fight as something ritualized. You are not simply fighting in an abandoned outdoor area. You are fighting within a defined boundary that has been marked with fire, which in Bloodborne's symbolic language consistently means something specific. This is a space of purification or containment. The candles placed around the arena are not merely decorative. In the context of Byrgenwerth's specific research tradition, candles were associated with the marking of ritual boundaries during the study of insight and Great One consciousness. The Shadow of Yharnam fight takes place within a space that has been prepared for a specific kind of encounter, one that requires boundary marking to be safe. The attack that the katana shadow uses, the horizontal sweep, is the longest range melee attack in the fight, and the one most likely to catch players who are tracking one of the other two shadows. The design of this attack as the longest reach is consistent with the idea that the three figures fight as a coordinated unit. The sword shadow keeps you occupied at close range. The torch shadow threatens you with fire and snakes, and the katana shadow punishes any attempt to create distance. The mist that rises from the ground during the later stages of the shadow fight is produced by the figures themselves, specifically by the transformation that the torch and snake shadow undergoes when sufficiently wounded. This snake mist, combined with the snake projectiles that the wounded shadow fires, creates an area of control that forces the player into a specific portion of the arena. The three shadows are capable of environmental manipulation, which goes beyond what most beast-type enemies in the game can do. The fact that the Shadow of Yharnam is a trio connects to the recurring significance of three in Bloodborne's broader symbolic system. The Healing Church has three main institutional branches. The Byrgenwerth school had three primary figures: Willem, Lawrence, and Gehrman. The game's endings involve three choices. The Shadow fight as the Guardian of Byrgenwerth replicates this three-fold structure in combat form. There is a note found near the entrance to the Shadow of Yharnam fight area that describes the figures as servants of the old blood. This framing is unusual because most of Yharnam's institutional servants are servants of the Church, and the Church was built on the old blood. The distinction the note is making may be between servants of the institutionalized version of the blood and servants of the blood in its older, less managed form. The Black Church set that corresponds to the Shadow's appearance is associated in its item description with the Healing Church's middle management, specifically with those who are trusted to operate independently, but not admitted to the choir's inner circle. This suggests that the shadows were a specific rank in the church's hierarchy, a rank defined by operational autonomy and plausible deniability. When all three shadows are at full health simultaneously, their attack patterns coordinate in a way that suggests they have a shared tactical awareness. If they were simply three independent enemies, their attack sequences would be independent. But watching carefully, there is a rhythm to their combined aggression that implies communication or shared instinct. They fight as a body rather than as individuals. The shadow of Yharnam's arena has a pathway along its edges, outside the ring of candles, that the shadows themselves don't use during combat. This pathway suggests that the arena was not originally a combat space. It was a ritual site with an observation path, a place where someone could watch what was happening in the central space from a safe distance. The fight is happening in what was once a ceremonial centre. The torch carried by one of the shadows is specifically distinctive from the torches carried by other enemies in the game. Its flame is a slightly different colour, burning slightly more blue than orange. Blue fire in Bloodborne's visual vocabulary is consistently associated with arcane properties, with energy that comes from the Great Ones rather than from ordinary combustion. The shadow's torch doesn't just burn, it burns with something else. After one shadow is killed, the remaining two become more aggressive. This escalation mechanic is common in multi-enemy encounters. But the specific way the shadow of Yharnam escalates is unusual. The surviving shadows don't just attack more frequently. Their attack patterns become more unpredictable, less coordinated. The loss of one figure disrupts the three-fold unit in a way that produces chaos rather than simply intensifying the existing order. The snakes that the third shadow releases are a visual echo of the snakes that appear in the Forbidden Woods area, which you traverse on the way to Byggenworth. The Forbidden Woods has a high concentration of snake transformations, individuals whose contact with Byggenworth's research has produced serpentine mutation rather than beast. Transformation. The shadow snakes mark a point on the same spectrum, connecting the guards of Byggenworth to the forest that surrounds it. The location of the shadow fight, on a path that goes from the Forbidden Woods to the Byggenworth Lake, places the encounter at a specific kind of transitional point. You are moving from the wild transformation space of the forest into the more managed, but ultimately more dangerous transformation space of Byggenworth itself. The shadows are the gate between those two modes. Master Willem's presence in Byggenworth, which you discover after defeating the shadows, is the payoff for everything the shadow fight implies. Willem's stillness, his transformed state, his connection to Kos through the Kos parasite, and the gesture he uses, all of this is Byggenworth's final statement. The shadows were defending a place that was already past saving, guarding a threshold whose interior was already gone. The shadow of Yharnam's drops include various consumable items related to the hunt, but no boss-specific badge or key item. This absence of a specific key drop is unusual for a story boss. The payoff for defeating the shadows is access rather than an item. You walk through the space they were blocking, and you find Byggenworth. The shadows give you a place, not a thing. There is a subtle audio shift between the Forbidden Woods and the Shadow of Yharnam arena that most players don't consciously register. The ambient sound in the woods is organic, birds and wind, and the sound of water in the distance. The Shadow arena's ambient audio is slightly more stripped, quieter in the organic registers, with a faint tonal element that sits underneath the natural sounds. This tonal underlay suggests the presence of something that isn't natural in the space, consistent with the ritual preparations visible in the candle and fire placement. The three shadows are sometimes interpreted as three aspects of a single consciousness rather than three separate individuals. This reading finds support in their identical appearance and in the coordinated nature of their combat, but it remains speculative. If they are aspects of one entity split across three bodies, that would connect them to Bloodborne's broader interest in what happens when consciousness is distributed rather than singular. The candles in the Shadow of Yharnam arena are placed in a pattern that, viewed from above, forms a specific geometric shape. Most players never achieve the elevation necessary to see this pattern clearly, and the game doesn't draw attention to it. But drone cameras and external video analysis have confirmed that the candle placement traces a shape consistent with the ritual geometries used in Chalice dungeon floor designs. The arena was built according to the same geometric principles that govern the ancient ritual sites. The Shadow of Yharnam fight has a relatively consistent difficulty rating that sits above the Witch of Hemwick but below the Vicar Amelia. It is the point in the game where multi-target combat becomes a sustained requirement rather than an occasional complication. The game is training you here for the more complex, simultaneous threat situations that appear later. The shadows are functional in both a narrative and a pedagogical sense. Each shadow, when killed, produces a slightly different death animation. The sword shadow collapses forward. The katana shadow spins before falling. The torch shadow, if wounded enough to trigger the snake emergence, collapses with its snake still moving after it. These distinct death animations preserve the individuality of the three figures within their larger unified identity. The shadow's location at the entrance to Beergenworth implies that they arrived there after Beergenworth was already abandoned, or at least compromised. If Beergenworth was a functioning academy when they took up their positions, they would be inside the building rather than at the external path leading to the lake. Their position on the approach suggests they came after the main event, stationed to keep people out of something that had already concluded. In the Chalice dungeons, there are enemies that share the Shadow's visual design and some of their combat behaviours. These Chalice dungeon versions of the Shadow are sometimes called the Shadows of Yharnam in community parlance, even though they don't carry that official name. Their presence in the Chalice dungeons suggests that the role the Shadows play, guarding specific thresholds against intrusion, extends into the deep ancient sites beneath the city. The torch Shadow's fire attacks have a range and a lingering burn that are disproportionate to the weapon type. A torch should produce a small and close-range fire hazard. The Shadow's torch produces fire that arcs across a significant portion of the arena and leaves a burn zone on the ground. This disproportionate power is consistent with the blue-tinted, arcane-associated flame visible on the torch. The fire comes from somewhere other than combustion. The mist produced by the wounded snake Shadow is not opaque enough to fully blind the player, but it is dense enough to significantly reduce visibility. This partial visual obstruction is the most complex environmental manipulation produced by any boss in the game up to this point in the narrative. The Shadow fight introduces the idea that a boss can actively reshape the arena as a weapon, a concept that the later game develops in much more dramatic ways. The three Shadows, in their identical appearance, raise a question about identity that runs throughout Bloodborne. Who are they individually? The game provides no names, no individual histories, no way to distinguish them except by their weapons. They are defined entirely by their function and their appearance. In a game obsessed with the question of what remains of a person's identity after transformation, the Shadows are the most extreme example of identities that have been subsumed into pure function. The final Shadow, whichever one survives longest, produces the most complex attack sequence of the fight. The survivor synthesizes elements of all three combat styles into a last stand pattern that requires the player to react to a wider variety of threats than any individual Shadow produced. This synthesis suggests that whatever the Shadows share, that shared element becomes more concentrated and expressive as the group is reduced. Fewer bodies, more intensity. Chapter 7. Dark Beast Paarl and the Lightning Below. Dark Beast Paarl is one of Bloodborne's most visually distinctive bosses and one of the most misunderstood in terms of what it represents. The massive beast crouching in the Hypogean Gal, covered in a crackling mesh of electricity, is not simply a powerful beast. It is a specific kind of transformation, one that the game's lore suggests is connected to a very different track of the Old Blood's effects than the Fur and Claws beast. Transformations you've seen before. The Hypogean Gaol is a prison that exists beneath Yharnam in a space that is not entirely physical. The Gaol is connected to the Hunter's Dream through the mechanic of being captured by the Snatchers, and its geography doesn't fully correspond to what you'd expect from Yharnam's physical layout. The prison occupies a liminal space, partially in Yharnam and partially in something adjacent to the Hunter's Dream. Dark Beast Parl is found at the lowest point of the Gaol, in a pit below the prison's main structure. The downward positioning is consistent with Bloodborne's use of depth as a narrative indicator. The deepest things are the oldest and most extreme. Parl's placement at the bottom suggests it has been there the longest, or has been pushed to the lowest and most forgotten corner of an already hidden space. The electricity that covers Parl's body is not something that appears in other beast transformations in the game. Beast transformations in Bloodborne consistently produce fur, elongated limbs, and enhanced physical attributes. Parl's electrical field is a different category of enhancement entirely. It suggests that what happened to Parl involved something that augmented the transformation with an energy source distinct from the Old Blood's usual effects. One reading of Parl's electricity is that it is related to the arcane energy associated with the Great Ones. Several Great Ones in the game produce or are surrounded by electrical effects, and the Great One's influence on human consciousness and biology is one of the central themes of Bloodborne's lore. If Parl was exposed to direct Great One influence on top of a beast transformation, the electrical field might be the visible result. Parl's name itself is interesting. Parl is a word of Dutch origin that means pearl. In Bloodborne's symbolism, pearls are consistently associated with the eyes of the Great Ones and with the insight mechanic. A dark beast named Pearl, crackling with arcane energy in the depths of a space that connects to the Hunter's Dream, is a very specific set of associations. Parl may represent a case where the transformation reached for something beyond the bestial and touched the divine. The fact that Parl is called a dark beast is significant. This is not just a description of the beast's coloration. In the context of Bloodborne's extended lore, the dark beast classification refers to a specific category of beast transformation that the Healing Church identified and classified separately from ordinary beast transformations. Dark beasts are not simply powerful beasts. They are beasts that have been fundamentally altered by something beyond the standard blood corruption. The Hypogean Gaol's prisoners, the people locked in the cells you pass on the way to Parl, are individuals captured by the Snatchers. These Snatchers operate on the night of the hunt specifically to collect specific types of individuals. Those with high insight, those who have had direct Great One contact, those who are considered spiritually or biologically significant by whoever is directing the Snatchers. The prison itself is a collection site for unusual people, and Parl, as its deepest prisoner, may be the most unusual. The Gaol's architecture, despite being a prison, has elements of ecclesiastical design that are unusual. The stonework in the lower levels uses decorative motifs associated with the Healing Church's older traditions. Whether this means the Gaol was built by or in cooperation with the Church, or whether it was built before the Church and repurposed, is not clear, but the Church's aesthetic fingerprints are on the walls of the space where Parl is kept. Dark Beast Parl can be found before or after Vicar Amelia, depending on whether the player is captured by the Snatchers while exploring. This sequence flexibility means that Parl's encounter doesn't fit neatly into the game's linear narrative progression. Some players fight Parl before they've even reached the Forbidden Woods. Others fight it late in the game as an afterthought. This temporal flexibility suggests that Parl's story is complete in itself, not dependent on context. The pit where Parl is contained has walls that are marked at various heights, with damage consistent with a very large creature repeatedly throwing itself against them. This damage pattern suggests that Paarl has been trying to escape for a long time, that the creature's confinement is not passive. Whatever intelligence or instinct Paarl retains, it is oriented toward breaking out rather than toward the kind of territorial pacing you see in beasts like the cleric beast. When Paarl is severely damaged, its electrical field becomes unstable, producing arcing discharges that are not targeted at the player specifically. These untargeted arcs suggest a loss of control rather than an escalation in deliberate aggression. As Paarl is weakened, the thing that's been contained within the electrical field becomes harder to maintain. The energy is still there, but the beast's ability to direct it is degrading. There is a shortcut in the Hypogean Gaol that, once opened, creates a connection between the Gaol and the Hemwick Charnel Lane area. This shortcut implies geographic proximity between the two areas that the surface-level map of Yharnam doesn't immediately suggest. Hemwick and the Gaol are connected underground in a way that might have operational implications. The Snatchers bringing people to the Gaol might have been using routes that pass through or near Hemwick's ritual sites. The Nightmare Apostle enemies found in the Hypogean Gaol are connected to the Rom fight and to the great web of insight-related horror that dominates Bloodborne's midgame. Their presence in the Gaol suggests that the prison has been penetrated by the nightmare reality that the game's second half is about. Paarl, at the bottom of a space that is already half nightmare, may itself be a product of that nightmare influence. Dark Beast Paarl drops the Spark Hunter badge when defeated. This badge, like the Sword Hunter badge dropped by the Cleric Beast, unlocks specific items from the Bath Messengers. The items unlocked by the Spark Hunter badge are predominantly bolt damage weapons and items, which are thematically consistent with the electrical nature of the Dark Beast. The badge is a classification tool. By killing Paarl, you have demonstrated expertise in dealing with the specific threat category that Paarl represents. The damage that bolt weapons do to Paarl is more nuanced than with other beast enemies. Most beast enemies take neutral to negative damage from bolt. Paarl, as a dark beast surrounded by electricity, is specifically vulnerable to bolt in a counterintuitive way. It seems like electricity should be neutral against an electrical creature. The explanation may be that the electricity surrounding Paarl is not the same as the bolt energy used by hunter weapons, and their interaction produces disruption rather than compatibility. The height of Dark Beast Paarl is the most significant physical characteristic for the fight mechanically. Paarl is tall enough that its head is almost unreachable from the ground without a vertical strike, and its belly is the most consistently accessible weak point during the fight. This verticality inverts the usual combat geometry of Bloodborne encounters, forcing a different approach than you use with other bosses. When Paarl rears back on its hind legs, which it does as a precursor to certain attacks, the electrical field around its body intensifies visibly. The intensification before specific attacks functions as a tell, but it's also narratively coherent. Paarl is channeling the electrical energy in its body into an attack, which requires focusing that energy, which makes it more visible. The open sky visible above the pit where Paarl is confined shows the same blood moon sky visible elsewhere in Yharnam after Amelia's death. Whether this sky is the same Yharnam sky or a version of it filtered through the Gaol's partially nightmare reality is unclear. But the blood moon above the Dark Beast's prison creates a visual connection between Paarl's existence and the cosmological events that dominate Bloodborne's late game. The bones and debris scattered around the bottom of the Paarl pit include what appear to be the remains of enemies or individuals who have been in the pit before you. Some of these remains are positioned in ways that suggest they tried to reach the pit's walls and failed. They weren't Paarl's prey in the traditional sense. They may have been people thrown into the pit with the beast. Paarl's movement speed, which is significantly faster than its size would suggest, is consistent with the electrical enhancement theory. The beast doesn't just have an electrical field for defense. The energy field may also be augmenting its physical speed in a way that the musculature alone couldn't account for. This combination of raw size and electrical speed makes Parl's closing distance the most dangerous element of the fight. In speedrun communities, the Hypogean Gal route, which requires deliberately getting caught by a snatcher, is the fastest known method of bypassing certain areas of the games. Early sections. The Gal is an intentional shortcut in the game's geography, accessible before you would normally reach the corresponding area through linear progression. This intentional shortcut design implies that the developers wanted players to find Parl earlier than its narrative placement would suggest. The Gal's cells contain items that belong to specific individuals, including Alfred's ring in one version of the lore reading. The cell occupants were real people, each with specific identities and histories, brought to this prison for specific reasons. Parl, at the bottom, is the culmination of this collection, the most extreme specimen in the Warden's collection, kept alive because it is too significant to destroy. The sound design for the Parl fight is dominated by the electrical crackle of the beast's field. This crackling serves both as an audio tell for Parl's attacks and as a constant atmospheric element that distinguishes the fight from every other Bloodborne encounter. No other boss fight has a persistent electrical audio element. The soundscape of the Parl fight is unique in the game. The weight of Dark Beast Parl's attacks, the impact force when they land, is among the highest in the game. Individual hits from Parl are more capable of staggering the player than comparable hits from most other bosses. This high-impact force is consistent with the electrical theory. The hits carry an electrical discharge that affects the nervous system in addition to the physical impact, producing a more extreme stagger reaction. Parl is one of the few bosses in the game that reappears in a slightly modified form in the Chalice dungeons. This Chalice version of the Dark Beast has the same basic design, but with different damage output scaling. The Chalice version's existence implies that what Parl is, the specific category of transformation it represents, was not unique to the surface world. Dark Beasts occurred in the ritual sites beneath Yharnam as well. The item description for the Spark Hunter badge describes the badge as identifying its bearer as a specialist in hunting a specific category of threat. The category implied by the badge is not just beasts in general, but something more specific, the transformed individuals who have developed an electrical relationship to the blood. This suggests that before the events of Bloodborne, dark beasts were common enough to require specialist hunters. Dark Beast Parl's existence in the Hypogean Gal, rather than in the open areas of Yharnam, suggests a deliberate decision to confine it. Someone put Parl here. The Snatchers bring captives to the Gal, and it's not unreasonable to suppose that the Snatchers or their masters also brought Parl here at some earlier point. The beast was captured and imprisoned, rather than simply found living in the Gal. What the purpose of keeping it was, and how long it's been here, are questions the game leaves entirely open. The ending of the Parl fight, with the beast collapsing in a cascade of electrical discharge, is visually the most dramatic individual boss death in the game up to this point. The electrical explosion radiates outward in a circle and then collapses inward, pulling the light back into the space where the beast was before fading. This implosion aesthetic is unusual in Bloodborne's boss death visual language, which generally favours outward dissolution. Parl's death goes the other way, as if the energy that was holding the transformation together is receding back into whatever source it came from. Chapter 8. Rom, the Vacuous Spider and the Veil of Forgetting. Rom, the Vacuous Spider, is the boss that the game's entire second act is building toward without ever naming explicitly. The blood moon, the gathering strange events, the shifting NPC behaviour, the hints about the choir's research at Byrgenwerth's lake, all of it is moving toward the moment when you face Rom, and the moment when killing Rom changes everything about Yharnam's world state. Rom was a scholar at Byrgenwerth. The item description for the empty phantasm shell, which is associated with Rom, describes a creature that was once human and that was transformed through exposure to the arcane. Knowledge pursued at Byrgenwerth under Master Willem's direction. What happened to Rom is the same thing that happened to Willem, but taken further, the pursuit of cosmic consciousness through the old blood and the study of the Great Ones produced a transformation that went beyond beast and beyond human into something else entirely. The lake at Moonside Lake, where you find Rom, is one of those Bloodborne locations that feels both beautiful and wrong in a way that's difficult to articulate. The still water, the blue-white moonlight, the low fog, all of this creates an aesthetic that is peaceful rather than threatening. The game is showing you something terrible in the most visually serene environment it has produced so far. This aesthetic dissonance is intentional. Rom's body, the giant white spider with the dull and passive face of someone looking at nothing in particular, is a perfect visual representation of what happened to a scholar who sought higher consciousness and found something that human minds were not built to contain. The body is large, passive, disconnected. The face is blank. Whatever Rom is experiencing, it is not the world you can see. The vacuous in Rom's title is the key word. It doesn't mean empty in the trivial sense. It means that what was there has been removed or has receded. Rom was full of intelligence, curiosity, scholarly drive, and that fullness has been replaced by something that has no equivalent in human experience. The vacancy is not absence. It is the presence of something that replaced the person. The children, the small spider creatures that surround Rom in the fight, are not hostile initially. They sit passively around the larger spider. Only when you attack Rom do they begin to move toward you. This passivity transforms into defensive aggression, which suggests that the children are oriented around Rom in a protective rather than predatory way. They are not hunting. They are attendants. The fact that killing Rom is the trigger for the Blood Moon's full emergence suggests that Rom was maintaining the veil that kept Yharnam's citizens from seeing the full reality of what Yharnam is. Rom's vacancy, the blank gaze that sees nothing in the ordinary world, was simultaneously a veil that kept the ordinary world from seeing certain things clearly. When Rom dies, the veil comes down. The Blood Moon doesn't appear from nowhere after Rom's death. Several characters in the game, before you fight Rom, refer to something that is about to happen or that has already begun happening. The Blood Moon was already coming. Rom was holding it back, or more precisely, Rom's existence was the last barrier between what Yharnam was and what Yharnam is about to become. Rom wasn't maintaining normalcy. They were maintaining the last concealment. The lake's water during the Rom fight is perfectly still despite the combat happening on its surface. The ripples you'd expect from large bodies falling into or moving across water don't appear. The lake exists according to different physical rules during the fight, consistent with the broader pattern in Bloodborne of boss arenas operating in a space that is adjacent to, but not identical to the physical world. The music during the Rom fight is one of the most complex compositions in the game. It incorporates a much wider range of instrumental textures than previous boss tracks, and has a quality that is less triumphant and more ceremonial. The fight's music sounds like an unravelling rather than a confrontation, consistent with what the fight represents, the dissolution of the last barrier between the visible. Yharnam and the cosmic nightmare beneath it. Master Willem, found in Byrgenwerth after the shadow fight, makes gestures toward the lake that most players interpret as pointing toward Kos. But Willem is also gesturing toward where Rom lives. The man who ran Byrgenwerth, who directed the research that transformed both himself and Rom, spends his existence pointing toward what his work produced. There is something specifically horrible about the idea that Willem's final cognitive action is oriented toward the consequences of his own decisions. Rom does not attack you during the initial approach phase of the fight. You can walk right up to Rom and begin hitting it before any of the spiders become hostile. This initial passivity is the most disturbing element of the encounter. A boss that doesn't even react to your presence isn't passive because it hasn't noticed you. It's passive because in some sense, you don't exist at the level of reality where Rom now operates. The arcane bolts that Rom fires during the fight are some of the most damaging projectiles in the game. They are also uniquely distinctive in their appearance, large and slow and devastating rather than small and fast. The scale and speed of these projectiles matches the general aesthetic of how Great One affiliated energy is depicted in Bloodborne. Rom's weapons are not hunter's tools or beast attacks, they are expressions of the cosmic. The teleportation that Rom uses to reset position during the fight is one of the most explicitly supernatural abilities in the game. Most enemies move through the physical world using their physical bodies. Rom does not travel from one location to another. Rom simply is somewhere different than it was. This spatial discontinuity is the most extreme version of the mobility that other bosses express through speed. The item you receive for defeating Rom, the Eye Pendant, is used to open the door to the lecture building, the secondary institution of higher learning that exists in the hunter's dream space. The lecture building connects Bloodborne's surface narrative to the hunter's nightmare narrative. Rom is the gatekeeper to both the surface game's second half and the DLC's entire existence. The Forbidden Woods shortcut that becomes available before the Moonside Lake area creates a visual corridor. Through the woods, past the snake transformations, along the path. Of Byrgenwerth's research to the lake. The geographic line from the woods to the lake is a narrative line from the consequences of Byrgenwerth's work to the work itself in its most extreme form. The small spiders that surround Rom do not loot drop anything individually. They exist purely as a mechanic to complicate the fight. But their existence raises a question about what they are ontologically. Are they creatures Rom produced? Creatures that were drawn to Rom? Extensions of Rom's own body projected into separate physical forms? The game doesn't answer this, and the lack of an answer is consistent with the kind of opacity that characterizes everything connected to Rom. When you look at Rom's face during the fight, in the moments between attacks when you might be close enough to see it clearly, the expression is the same at 10% health, as it is at full health. Rom is not distressed by the fight. Rom is not more urgent or more threatened as the battle progresses. The expression never changes, which is the most unsettling consistency in the game. Being killed doesn't register for Rom in any way you can read. The Healing Church's involvement in Byrgenwerth's research was specifically in the transformation techniques that Byrgenwerth developed. The choir's experiments at the Grand Cathedral and at the orphanage are downstream of what Willem was doing at Byrgenwerth. Rom is the product of the upstream work. Rom is what you get when you pursue Byrgenwerth's goals at maximum intensity, which is why the Healing Church's official history never explicitly discusses what happened at the lake. The moonlight at Moonside Lake is different from the moonlight visible elsewhere in Yharnam. The moon that illuminates the lake is larger and more proximate than the one in the city sky. One reading is that the lake is closer to the moon, not geographically, but cosmologically, that the site of Byrgenwerth's most extreme research has a proximity to the cosmic level of reality that ordinary Yharnam doesn't share. There are small details on the lake's shore before and during the fight that suggest the area has been used for rituals, specific patterns in the arrangement of stones at the waterline, markings on the cliff face visible from the lake's surface, a concentration of specific flora that in Bloodborne's environmental language appears near sites of old blood research. The lake itself is not a natural body of water left undisturbed. It has been used. Rom's death produces an explosion of light that briefly obscures the arena entirely. When the light clears, the Moonside Lake is the same, but the sky has changed. The blood moon is now fully visible, and permanent for the rest of the game's main story. This visual transition from the fight's ending to the changed sky is Bloodborne's most dramatic single environmental shift, more impactful than anything that precedes it. The phrase "the vacuous Rom" in Master Willem's dialogue, which he uses in a context that suggests he's aware of what Rom has become, is the only direct character acknowledgement. Of Rom's existence in the game. One man mostly transformed himself, pointing at a lake and knowing what's in it. The isolation of that knowledge, the way the entire history of Byggenworth has been reduced to two transformed scholars at either end of a body of still water, is one of Bloodborne's most economical pieces of tragedy. In the Hunter's Nightmare Dielk, Ludwig fights with the holy moonlight sword, and the moonlight in that space has a specific quality that is consistent with the moonlight at Moonside Lake. The connection between the Moonside Lake's cosmic proximity and the Hunter's Nightmare's version of moonlight suggests that the nightmare space and the lake share a relationship to the same cosmological source. Rom, at the lake, may be a bridge between the surface world and the nightmare dimension, in the same way that the hunter's dream is a bridge between death and resurrection. The vacuity that defines Rom is the game's most direct statement about the cost of Byrgenwerth's project. Willem's goal was to expand human consciousness to the point where it could perceive and communicate with the Great Ones. The result of that expansion, in Rom's case, is a consciousness that no longer has a bottom, no longer has a human centre to organise its perceptions from. Rom sees everything and is present nowhere. The goal was achieved, and it was exactly as terrible as it should have been. The surface of Moonside Lake reflects the blood moon after Rom's death, in a way that is slightly different from how a physical water surface would reflect the sky. The reflection is more detailed than the actual sky, as though the lake is not just reflecting the moon, but is itself a window to something the sky is only a dim projection of. After Rom's death, the lake's water is no longer just water. Defeating Rom is the moment in Bloodborne where the player fully crosses from a game about hunting monsters in a cursed city into a game about the nature of consciousness, the Great Ones, and the cosmic horror that Yharnam was built on top of. Everything before Rom is prologue. Everything after Rom is the actual story. The fight itself is the hinge. Chapter 9. The One Reborn and the choir's final failure. The One Reborn is the boss that stands between you and the nightmare of Mensis, and it is one of the most explicitly revolting entities in the game. A pile of limbs and corpses animated into a single mass by something the choir has done, the One Reborn represents the most complete and most catastrophic failure of the healing. Church's research program. The Yhargul area, where the One Reborn waits, is the part of Yharnam that the choir has been using as an operational base for its most extreme experiments. Yhargul is sometimes called the Unseen Village, and the name carries a double meaning. It is both literally hidden from most of Yharnam and figuratively hidden from the public. Understanding of what the Healing Church does. The One Reborn's construction, as best as it can be understood from the fight, involves multiple human bodies fused into a single mass that has been given a collective animation by whatever the choir's ritual produced. This is not a beast transformation. This is something the church built deliberately. The One Reborn is a manufactured entity, assembled from parts rather than emerged from corruption. The bell maidens on the pillars above the One Reborn arena are one of the most important elements of the fight's design. They ring bells that strengthen the One Reborn and summon additional threats. Before you can effectively fight the main boss, you need to reach the upper level and silence the maidens. This two-level fight structure mirrors the hierarchical structure of the choir itself. There are those who give power and those who receive it, and dealing with the source of power is often more important than dealing with its expression. The Bell Maidens are themselves interesting figures in Bloodborne's lore. They appear in multiple contexts throughout the game, connected to the summoning of phantoms and to ritual bell ringing that has Great One associations. Their role in the One Reborn fight as empowerment sources for the main boss connects them to the choir's research into using specific individuals as conduits for Great One energy. The projectile vomit attack that the One Reborn uses, the arcing columns of blood and organic matter that crash down across the arena, is the most overtly disgusting attack in the game. Its disgust is probably intentional. The choir's greatest creation expresses itself through an act of biological rejection, spewing out the material that makes it up in an attack. That is as much self-destruction as aggression. The One Reborn falls and rises multiple times during the fight. Knocking it down doesn't kill it. It gets back up and continues. This repeated resurrection is the most literal expression of the Reborn in its name. The entity has been built to persist, to reassemble, to continue regardless of damage. The choir built this thing to be indestructible. The fact that you can kill it suggests that the choir's confidence in their creation exceeded the creation's actual capabilities. There is no version of the One Reborn that appears to have been made with individual consent. The people whose bodies were used to construct it were not volunteers. Whatever process the choir used to gather the material for this creation was not something anyone chose to participate in. The One Reborn is built entirely out of victims. The Yharnam area that leads to the One Reborn contains some of the most densely layered lore in the game. The various enemies, the architecture, the item placements, and the layout of the space all point toward a district that was subjected to intense and prolonged church experimentation. The residents of Yharnam were not just caught in the plague, they were specifically targeted by the church's agenda. After defeating the One Reborn, you gain access to the Nightmare of Mensis, which is the third act of the game's main story. The One Reborn is the gate to that space in the same way that Rom was the gate to Yharnam. The progression from Rom to the One Reborn to Mensis describes a steadily escalating engagement with the Great Ones, each step going further into the cosmic horror at the games center. The item dropped by the One Reborn, the yellow backbone, is used in blood gem enhancement. This is one of the most technically useful drops in the game for build optimization. But the item's name, the yellow backbone, is a physical description. You are receiving a piece of the thing you just killed. The One Reborn, built from assembled human parts, leaves behind a piece of itself as a material resource. The choir's creation contributes to the hunt, even in death. The One Reborn's arena, the plaza in Yharnam, is surrounded by architecture that is specific to the choir's operational aesthetic. The symbols, the layout, the type of stone used, all of it is consistent with the choir's other installations. This is not just a location the One Reborn ended up in. It is a location built for it, or rebuilt around it, by the people who created it. The size of the One Reborn is inconsistent throughout the fight in a way that suggests the entity is not maintaining a stable form. The mass it presents at different moments in the battle is not identical. This instability is consistent with the idea that what animates the One Reborn is not doing so completely. The life it has been given is enough to make it dangerous, but not enough to make it coherent. The choir robes visible on some of the Bell Maidens in the upper level of the One Reborn arena connect the ritual support structure of the fight directly to the healing. Churches in a circle. These are not incidental figures doing ritualistic things. They are certified practitioners of the choir's methodology, doing exactly what they were trained to do in service of the creation they're empowering. The moon visible above Yharnam during the One Reborn fight shows the blood moon in its full state, consistent with the post-Rom world state. This consistency confirms that the One Reborn was not created in response to the blood moon. It predates the blood moon's emergence. The choir built this before the conditions that now make Yharnam's situation fully visible to its inhabitants. There is a specific part of the One Reborn's attack pattern that involves the entity orienting its largest visible face, if you can call it a face, toward the player before firing a charged arcane projectile. This orientation behavior is the closest the One Reborn comes to intentionality. Most of its attacks seem automatic, reflexive, rather than deliberate. The charged projectile is different. The One Reborn tracks you with it. The tracking behavior is significant because it suggests the presence of some form of directed cognition in the One Reborn. The people whose bodies were used to build it may still be present in some form, their individual consciousnesses contributing to a collective orientation that is capable of specific attention. Whether this is a compassionate or a horrifying reading depends on how you feel about collective consciousness, but Bloodborne tends to frame collective consciousness as horror. The One Reborn's attacks do not do fire damage despite the visual elements of burning in the boss's design. This is mechanically unusual. Bosses in Bloodborne generally do damage that corresponds visually to the type of attack. The One Reborn's attacks are arcane rather than fire, which confirms that what animates the mass is arcane energy, Great One adjacent force, rather than simple biological processes. The path through Yharnam to the One Reborn passes through a series of rooms that contain evidence of the choir's work, experimental chambers, containment structures, evidence of rituals conducted and abandoned. The choir was done with this space before you arrive. They finished what they were doing in Yharnam and moved on, or were stopped by the blood moon, or were caught up in the collapse that their own research precipitated. The One Reborn is the finished product, left running without supervision. The specific nature of what the One Reborn is supposed to accomplish is not stated explicitly in the game. The choir built it for a reason. What that reason was is left to interpretation. One reading is that the One Reborn was intended as a vessel, a physical form capable of containing or hosting Great One consciousness in a stable way. If this reading is correct, then the One Reborn is not just a weapon or an experiment. It is the choir's answer to the question of how you give a Great One a body. Defeating the One Reborn is the last act in Bloodborne's critique of the Healing Church as an institution. After this fight, the remaining enemies and obstacles are connected to forces older than the Church, the Pthumerian Queens and their nightmare, the Great Ones themselves. The Church is behind you. The One Reborn is the final statement. This is what the institution built with its knowledge, its power, and the bodies of its subjects. Chapter 10. Mikolash, host of the nightmare and the mad scholar's dream. Mikolash, host of the nightmare, is the most deliberately theatrical boss in Bloodborne. He runs, he recites, he philosophizes, he laughs. He is the one boss in the game who speaks throughout the encounter rather than simply vocalizing. What he says is as important as how you fight him, and what he says reveals more about Bloodborne's cosmology than almost any other single source in the game. Mikolash was a scholar of Mensis, the school that attempted to make contact with the Great Ones in a way even more extreme than what Byrgenwerth attempted. The school of Mensis believed that creating a direct channel to the Great Ones through a combination of ritual, blood, and collective cognitive sacrifice would allow the scholars to ascend to a higher plane of consciousness. They achieved something, but what they achieved was not what they intended. The Nightmare of Mensis is the space where the School of Mensis currently exists, having been pulled entirely into a nightmare dimension through the ritual they conducted. Mikolash is not alive in any conventional sense. He is a consciousness that was folded into the nightmare and is now the most coherent surviving fragment of what the school was. Mikolash runs from you throughout the first phase of the fight. This is the most unusual boss mechanic in the game. You are chasing a boss through a labyrinthine maze of corridors while he recites fragments of the lore that defines the game's cosmology. The chase itself is a statement. Understanding Bloodborne's deepest truths requires pursuing them. The knowledge doesn't stand still. The lines that Micolash speaks during the chase are among the most quotable in Bloodborne, his invocations of Kos, his reflections on eyes and consciousness, his references to the nightmare and the physical form as a cage for higher perception. These lines are not random ravings. They are the surviving, coherent output of a scholar who achieved a kind of cosmic perception, but whose mind has been fractured by the experience. The Mensis cage, the large iron cage that Micolash wears on his head, is the most immediately striking visual element of the character. The cage functions as a vessel for attracting higher forms of consciousness. By wearing the cage over his head, Micolash was attempting to make his mind accessible to the Great Ones, to lower the barrier between human perception and cosmic awareness. The cage worked. That's what's wrong with Micolash. The other Mensis scholars who appear in the research hall in the DLC also wear versions of the cage. The entire school adopted this practice, collectively. The mass adoption of the cage ritual is what allowed the School of Mensis to be pulled into the nightmare as a group, rather than individually. They went together into the thing they were trying to reach. The room where Micolash is cornered at the end of the first chase is a mirrored room. Two identical spaces face each other, and Micolash and the player appear simultaneously in both. This mirroring is one of Bloodborne's more explicitly symbolic moments. The scholar and the hunter face each other as reflections, neither quite real in the conventional sense, both existing in a space that doubles everything. The fight itself, once Micolash is cornered, is mechanically unusual. He uses arcane attacks, specifically the A Call Beyond spell, which is one of the most powerful arcane attacks available to player characters in the game. Micolash is using the same tools available to the player. He is not a beast, not a church figure in vestments, not a manufactured entity. He is a human scholar in a cage, and he is trying to kill you with knowledge. A Call Beyond, the attack Micolash uses, is described in its item text as a call to the Great Ones, specifically asking for their help in targeting something. Micolash is not casting a spell, he is making a request. And the Great Ones are responding. Every time Micolash fires that attack, a Great One is complying with his request. The fight has a third participant who is invisible and enormous. After the first phase, Micolash escapes again, and a second chase begins. This second chase goes further into the nightmare's geography, into spaces that are less architecturally coherent, more directly shaped by dream logic. The further you chase Micolash, the more obviously dream-shaped the environment becomes, until the final confrontation room is barely a room at all, just a defined space in what is clearly no longer a building. Mikolash's laughter during the fight is not the laughter of someone who finds the situation funny. It is the laughter of someone who is operating at a register of experience where conventional emotional responses don't apply. He laughs because whatever the nightmare has done to his cognition, humour is no longer a measured response to amusement. It is a more ambient expression of whatever state he's in. The quote Micolash speaks about Kos, specifically the Grant-a-Size invocation, is the most directly cosmological statement any character in the game makes. Eyes in Bloodborne are the organ of higher consciousness, the physical feature that the Great Ones covet because it represents the capacity for the kind of perception they possess. Asking Kos to grant eyes is asking to be elevated to Great One level consciousness. Micolash is still trying to achieve the thing that pulled the school into the nightmare. The nightmare that the School of Mensis exists in is described in item descriptions as a space created by the school's collective dream, a nightmare they induced and then got trapped in. The nightmare was supposed to be temporary, a bridge to contact rather than a permanent state. But whatever crossed over from the Great One's side of the bridge has not allowed the school to cross back. The specific entity that the School of Mensis was trying to contact, based on the available lore, was Murgo. Murgo is a Great One's child, specifically the child of Odin and Yharnam the Thumerian queen. The Mensis scholars believed that contacting Murgo would give them access to Murgo's inheritance of Great One nature. What they got was Murgo's attention, and Murgo's attention, like most Great One attention, is not comfortable for human minds. When Michaelash is killed in the second confrontation, his death is theatrical even then. He gives a final monologue, a last invocation that he delivers while dying. No other boss in the game speaks during their death sequence. Michaelash's death is a performance, the last lecture of a scholar who has nothing left to say but who cannot stop saying it. After Michaelash's death, the nightmare doesn't change. The School of Mensis doesn't end. The nightmare continues, presumably, after you leave it. Michaelash was the host of the nightmare, meaning he was a specific function, the entity whose consciousness the nightmare was rooted in. His death might theoretically dissolve the nightmare, or it might simply leave the nightmare running without a host, unmanaged and infinite. The items left in the Nightmare of Mensis, the Mensis cage you can find and wear yourself, the various runes and notes, all of them describe a project that began with ambition and certainty and produced something that none of the people involved would have chosen if they'd understood what the outcome would be. Michaelash's surviving coherence is a kind of irony. He understands more than he ever did, but the understanding exists in a context where it can't be acted on. Michaelash's dialogue includes references to his physical body, which is presumably still in Yharnam, connected to the nightmare by the ritual that put him here. Most players never encounter this body directly, but the implication that there is a physical Michaelash somewhere in Yharnam, in a catatonic state, hosting the nightmare, is one of the game's most disturbing background details. The man whose mind you're chasing through corridors is also simultaneously lying somewhere in a body, dreaming. The Nightmare of Mensis as a space was produced by the collective consciousness of the school's scholars. This means the architecture you traverse to reach Michaelash is a physical expression of how those scholars thought, specifically how they thought about the Great Ones, the blood, the nature of consciousness, and the path to higher awareness. The nightmare is an architectural manifestation of Mensis ideology. The School of Mensis, in terms of institutional timeline, was active after Byrgenwerth, but apparently concurrent with the Healing Church rather than a precursor to it. Mensis and the Church were pursuing parallel tracks of research at approximately the same time. Whether they shared information, competed for resources, or were actively hostile to each other is not definitively established. But the existence of two institutions pursuing the same general goal at the same time suggests that knowledge of the old blood and the Great Ones was available to multiple groups simultaneously. The Mensis cage's design, which functions as a signal receiver for Great One consciousness, is also visually similar to certain decorative elements in Byrgenwerth. This visual rhyme between the cage and Byrgenwerth's aesthetic suggests that the School of Mensis was working from Byrgenwerth's research rather than from an independent tradition. Michaelash and the school he hosted are Byrgenwerth's philosophical children, just as the Healing Church is its institutional one. Michaelash's final location in the nightmare, the room where he makes his last stand, has a specific architectural detail that is easy to miss during the fight itself. The floor has a geometric pattern that is consistent with the ritual geometries of the Chalice dungeons. Even in the nightmare, even in the deepest space the school retreated into, the ground is marked with the same ancient signs that underlie all of Yharnam's history. The word host in Michaelash's title has a specific resonance in Bloodborne's cosmological framework. A host is something that provides sustenance and space for another entity to exist. Michael Ash is the host of the nightmare, in the same way that a human body is the host for an infectious agent. He did not choose to be permanent, but the nightmare found him necessary and has not released him. His death, when it comes, is as much a release as a defeat. Chapter 11. Murgo's Wet Nurse and the Eternal Cry. Murgo's Wet Nurse is the final mandatory boss of Bloodborne's main story, and it is the boss that the game has been building towards since the moment Gascoigne's music box played the first wrong note. The nurse guards Murgo, the child of Odin and the Pthumerian queen, in the deepest part of the nightmare of Mensis, and the child never stops crying. The crying is the first thing you hear when you reach the final area of the nightmare of Mensis. It precedes the wet nurse fight and continues during it. You never see Murgo. The Great One child is invisible, presumably always has been, consistent with Adon's nature as a formless Great One whose presence exists without physical form. The child of the formless has no body to be visible in. The wet nurse itself is a massive dark figure with multiple arms, specifically 6 arms that extend from a form wrapped in what appears to be cloth or shadow. The arms are too many, and the proportions are wrong in a way that places the nurse firmly outside the category of human transformation. This entity was never a person. It belongs to a different order of being from the start. The wet nurse's function is care. Whatever Murgo is, and Murgo is likely dead given that the Pthumerian queen lost her child to the Great One's intrusion, the wet nurse has been maintaining the vigil of care for something that may no longer be there. One of the most disturbing readings of the Murgo situation is that the crying you hear throughout the nightmare is not a living child's cry. It is the echo of an infant who died and whose death Yharnam's blood magic will not allow to fully register. If Murgo is dead, but the Great One's imprint of Murgo's existence persists as a kind of cosmic echo, then the nightmare of Mensis is a space maintained around a ghost cry. A literal nightmare built on the traumatic memory of a child's death. The school of Mensis touched this memory and was pulled into it. The wet nurse has been standing over it since before the school arrived. The 6 arms of the wet nurse present a specific combat challenge because they obscure the predictability of attack patterns that you develop for single-armed or twin-armed bosses. An entity with 6 arms has a greater range of possible attack vectors, and the nurse uses them intelligently, alternating arms in ways that prevent the player from establishing a simple dodge rhythm based on one arm's telegraph. The phase transition in the wet nurse fight, which involves the nurse retreating into a darkness that fills the arena and spawning shadow copies of itself, is the most explicitly cosmic fight design in the game. The darkness is not environmental. The nurse generates it. Whatever the wet nurse is made of, it can produce and retract a personal darkness that covers the arena in a way that no physical object can explain. The shadow copies that appear during the nurse's dark phase deal full damage despite being visually indistinct from shadows. This full damage presence of essentially visual hallucinations in a fight about a Great One and cosmic consciousness is consistent with Bloodborne's argument about the relationship between perception and reality. If you can see it at this level, it can hurt you. The rules that apply to ordinary enemies do not apply here. The sound design of the wet nurse fight is dominated by the combination of the nurse's own sounds, which are not quite vocalizations and not quite physical sounds, but something in between, and the persistent crying of Murgo beneath or behind everything else. 2 audio tracks play simultaneously, the combat and the grief. They don't resolve into each other. There is a specific moment in the wet nurse fight when the nurse pauses. It is brief and seems to be a mechanical recovery between attacks, but it corresponds with a slight shift in the background crying. The pitch changes for a moment. Whether this is an intentional audio synchronization between the boss's animation and the background audio, or a coincidence of the audio mixing, is unclear. But the pause and the pitch shift together create an impression that something in the space is responding to the fight. Defeating the wet nurse does not stop the crying. The sound continues for a moment after the nurse's death, and then it fades gradually rather than cutting off. The fade suggests that whatever Murgo is, its persistence is not entirely dependent on the nurse's protection. The nurse was a guardian, but Murgo's existence, or the echo of it, will simply continue without a guardian. After the wet nurse is dead, you receive the Cord of the Eye, which is the item you give to Gehrman or to the Moon Presence, depending on your ending path. The Cord of the Eye is associated with Murgo, specifically with the connection between Murgo's Great One nature and the human consciousness that the game's protagonist has been developing through insight. The cord is the bridge between those two things. The Moon Presence, which appears if you collect enough umbilical cords before the Gehrman fight, enters through the sky above the Hunter's Dream after Gehrman's defeat. The Moon Presence's arrival is the game's last major revelation. There is a Great One who has been managing the Hunter's Dream, who owns Gehrman, who owns the cycle of hunt and death and resurrection that the player has been participating in. The wet nurse fight, and everything it unlocks, is what allows you to either accept or resist that management.